The boardroom was so silent that the soft click of a fountain pen hitting the polished mahogany table sounded like a gunshot. 40 pairs of eyes locked onto Ethan Sinclair. The billionaire heir to Sinclair Holdings stood at the head of the table, staring at a document worth nearly $12 billion. One signature would make him the youngest executive chairman in the company's history. One signature would also cost him the woman he loved. His father's voice cut through the silence. "Sign it." No one moved. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled beneath the afternoon sun, unaware that one man's decision was about to change countless lives forever. Ethan slowly picked up the expensive gold pen. Every executive leaned forward. The company's lawyers exchanged confident smiles. Financial reporters waited outside for the historic announcement. This was supposed to be the day the Sinclair empire entered a new era. Instead, Ethan placed the pen back on the table. He gently closed the folder. Then he looked his father in the eyes. "I won't." A wave of disbelief swept across the room. "You don't understand what's at stake," his father said, his voice low but firm. "I do," Ethan replied calmly. "Then why would you throw everything away?" For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Not because he didn't have an answer, because for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't owe everyone an explanation for choosing his own peace. He buttoned his suit jacket, picked up nothing. Not the contract, not the company phone, not even the keys to the luxury car waiting downstairs. He simply turned and walked toward the massive wooden doors. "If you walk out," his father called after him, "you walk away from your inheritance, your company, and this family." Ethan stopped. The room held its breath. Without turning around, he quietly answered, "Then today, I finally learn what my life is worth without any of those things." The doors closed behind him, and just like that, one of America's youngest billionaires walked away from everything money could buy. But what no one in that room knew was that he'd already lost something far more valuable years before. He had lost the woman who once loved him without caring about his wealth. He had traded love for ambition, peace for power, his heart for an empire. And now, the price of success had finally come due. Have you ever watched someone chase success so relentlessly that they lost the very people they were trying to make proud? Or maybe you've experienced something similar yourself. Have you ever stayed in a relationship that slowly erased your confidence? Accepted a job that demanded your self-respect? Or kept saying yes until you no longer recognized yourself? If so, this story isn't just about a billionaire. It's about anyone who has ever confused achievement with happiness. It's about learning that the strongest people aren't the ones who win every battle. They're the ones brave enough to walk away from the battles that cost them their soul. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you're new here, welcome to a place where every love story is more than romance. Every journey is filled with powerful lessons about life, relationships, forgiveness, self-respect, and the choices that shape our future. If stories that touch your heart and leave you thinking long after they end are your kind of stories, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and become part of our growing family. You never know, the next story might be the one that changes the way you see your own life. Now settle in, because today's story isn't about how a billionaire became rich. It's about how he almost became too rich to recognize the value of love. This is the story of Ethan Sinclair, a man who possessed everything the world admired: private jets, luxury estates, international influence, and more money than he could spend in a lifetime. Yet none of it could buy back the one thing greed and ambition had stolen from him. Sometimes, the greatest heartbreak isn't losing the person you love. Sometimes it's realizing you were the one who let them go. And by the end of this story, you'll discover why the greatest fortune any person can possess isn't found in a bank account. It's found in the courage to choose self-respect, honesty, and love before it's too late. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime. Ethan Sinclair stepped inside alone. For the first time in years, there was no assistant beside him reminding him of his next meeting. No attorney carrying confidential files. No security team clearing the hallway ahead. Only silence. He pressed the button for the lobby. The mirrored walls reflected a man the world envied. A tailored navy suit, an expensive Swiss watch, perfectly polished shoes. A face that had appeared on magazine covers beside headlines celebrating billion-dollar acquisitions and record-breaking profits. Yet, the man staring back at him looked exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. The elevator descended floor by floor, each soft ding sounding less like a countdown and more like the closing of one chapter of his life. His phone vibrated, then again, and again. The screen filled with missed calls. Dad, Board Chairman General Counsel, Chief Financial Officer. Mom, unknown number. He looked at the screen for several seconds before pressing the power button. The display faded to black. For years, Ethan had believed being constantly available made him dependable. Today, he finally understood that never making yourself available to your own heart came with an even greater cost. When the elevator reached the lobby, the receptionist immediately stood. "Mr. Sinclair, your car is waiting." Ethan smiled politely. "Please let the driver know he can head home." She blinked in confusion. "Sir? I'm walking." Before she could respond, he thanked her for her years of kindness and walked through the revolving doors onto Fifth Avenue. Warm summer air greeted him. People hurried past carrying shopping bags, coffee cups and briefcases. A street musician played a soulful melody on a saxophone. A little boy laughed as pigeons scattered across the sidewalk. Life moved forward, completely unaware that one of the country's most influential businessmen had just abandoned the future everyone expected him to claim. For the first time in decades, Ethan had nowhere he needed to be. No investor presentation, no conference call, no private flight, no dinner with potential partners. Just an unfamiliar freedom that felt equal parts peaceful and terrifying. As he walked, memories surfaced uninvited, not of victories, not of celebrations, but of moments he had quietly surrendered pieces of himself. He remembered being 12 years old, proudly carrying a first-place ribbon from his school's regional art competition. He had spent weeks on the painting. His teacher told him he had real talent. He couldn't wait to show his father. That evening, he rushed into his father's office. "Dad, look what I won." Richard Sinclair glanced up from a stack of financial reports for barely 2 seconds. "That's nice." He immediately returned to his paperwork. "Leave it on the shelf." Ethan remained standing. "I was hoping we could celebrate." His father sighed. "Ethan, one competition doesn't build a future." The boy looked down at the ribbon. "I know. You'll understand when you're older. Success requires focus." Those words stayed with him. Over time, he stopped bringing home paintings. Then he stopped entering competitions altogether. Eventually, he convinced himself he hadn't loved painting in the first place. Looking back, he realized that wasn't true. He had simply learned to love approval more. A taxi sped past, snapping him back to the present. He paused at a crosswalk as pedestrians flowed around him. Across the street, a father knelt beside his daughter, helping her tie the laces on her tiny sneakers. The little girl looked up and wrapped her arms around his neck. The father laughed, lifting her into the air before setting her back on her feet. It was a simple moment, one that would never appear in business magazines or annual reports. Yet Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had witnessed something that felt so valuable. His father had given him every material advantage imaginable: the finest schools, luxury homes, private tutors, business mentors. But moments like that, those had always been postponed until later. Later, after the next acquisition. Later, after the next expansion. Later, after success was complete. Except, success was never complete. There was always another mountain to climb, another company to buy, another deal to close, another sacrifice waiting to be justified. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of a nearby bicycle bell. A delivery cyclist swerved around him, apologizing with a quick wave. Ethan smiled. "No problem." The cyclist was already gone. He continued walking without any destination in mind until the towering buildings gradually gave way to the familiar green entrance of Central Park. He hadn't been there in years. As a child, his mother occasionally brought him there on Sunday mornings before his father's meetings consumed the rest of the day. Back then, he loved watching artists paint landscapes beneath the trees. He wondered if any of them were still here. Stepping onto the winding path, he immediately noticed something different. No one cared who he was. Joggers passed without a second glance. An elderly couple shared a bench while feeding birds. College students laughed over a game of chess. Children chased bubbles floating through the afternoon air. It felt strangely comforting. For once, he wasn't the billionaire everyone wanted something from. He was simply another person searching for a quiet place to think. He found an empty bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down. The silence wasn't complete. Birdsong blended with distant conversations and the soft rustle of leaves. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of possibility. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to ask a question he had buried beneath meetings, obligations, and expectations. Who am I when no one is telling me who I should be? The answer didn't come immediately, but for the first time, he was willing to wait for it. Ethan remained on the bench longer than he intended. Minutes slipped by without him checking the time. That alone felt unfamiliar. For years, every hour of his day had belonged to someone else. A board meeting, a shareholder call, a fundraising dinner, an interview, or another flight to another city. His calendar had been planned months in advance, leaving no room for the unexpected. Today, the only thing on his schedule was silence. He realized how rare that had become. A cool breeze drifted through the park, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Somewhere nearby, a violinist played a slow melody that blended with the laughter of children chasing soap bubbles. Life continued, without asking anyone's permission. Perhaps that was its greatest lesson. As Ethan watched people pass by, he noticed something he had spent years overlooking. None of these people appeared to be in a hurry to prove their worth. An elderly couple sat hand in hand, sharing a sandwich while smiling at each other between quiet conversations. A young father patiently taught his son how to ride a bicycle, cheering every tiny success. Two nurses, still wearing hospital scrubs, laughed over paper cups of coffee, as though they had forgotten the exhaustion of their shift. No one seemed concerned about stock prices. No one talked about quarterly earnings. No one cared who owned what. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered whether he had spent years climbing the wrong mountain. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Mr. Sinclair?" He turned. Standing a few feet away was Harold Morrison, an elderly groundskeeper who had worked in Central Park for more than 30 years. Ethan recognized him immediately. When Ethan was a boy, Harold had often been sweeping the same walking paths while offering friendly greetings to families passing through. Harold smiled warmly. "I haven't seen you here in a very long time." Ethan stood and shook his hand. "It's been years. Your mother used to bring you here every spring. I remember. You always carried a sketchbook." Ethan blinked. "I did. You'd sit over there by the lake for hours drawing trees and birds. I figured you'd become an artist someday." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "So did I." Harold tilted his head. "What happened?" The question was simple, yet it landed harder than any business negotiation Ethan had ever faced. He looked toward the lake before answering. "Life happened." Harold nodded slowly. "Sometimes, life doesn't happen to us." He leaned lightly on his broom. "Sometimes we keep saying yes to things until one day we realize we've been saying no to ourselves." The words settled heavily in Ethan's heart. He wasn't sure whether Harold intended them as advice or simple observation. Either way, they felt true. Educational moments often arrived quietly, without sounding like lectures. Ethan had spent decades believing success required sacrificing every personal dream. Now he was beginning to wonder whether the greatest success was protecting the parts of yourself that made life meaningful. They spoke for several more minutes before Harold returned to work. As he walked away, he called over his shoulder. "Don't wait another 10 years before visiting again." "I won't," Ethan replied. And for the first time that day, he meant every word. Ethan wandered deeper into the park. The afternoon sun filtered through towering oak branches, creating shifting patterns of light across the walking paths. Then he noticed something unusual. A small crowd had gathered beneath a large maple tree. Curious, he moved closer. At the center sat a woman surrounded by easels and paintbrushes. Children of different ages formed a semicircle around her, each holding a canvas. She wasn't painting for them. She was teaching them how to see. "What color is the sky?" she asked with a smile. A little boy answered immediately. "Blue." She nodded. "Sometimes." The children looked confused. She pointed upward. "What else do you notice?" One girl squinted thoughtfully. "I see white clouds." "Good." Another child raised his hand. "I see a little bit of orange." "Excellent." The woman smiled proudly. "Do you know why all your answers are right?" The children shook their heads. "Because observation is personal." She dipped her brush into soft shades of blue and lavender. "Real artists don't paint what they're told to see." She looked around the group. "They paint what they truly notice." Ethan found himself listening. Her lesson wasn't really about painting. It was about life. How often did people stop noticing the world because they were too busy accepting someone else's version of it? The woman continued. "Never let someone convince you that your perspective doesn't matter simply because it's different." One little girl hesitated before speaking. "But what if they laugh at my picture?" The woman crouched beside her. "Then remember something very important." She smiled gently. "The opinion of someone who isn't creating should never stop the person who is." The little girl's face brightened. She picked up her paintbrush again. Ethan couldn't help smiling. That single sentence carried more wisdom than many leadership seminars he had attended. Real confidence wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about continuing anyway. The class ended with applause from parents waiting nearby. The children proudly held up their colorful paintings before running toward their families. The woman began cleaning her brushes. Only then did Ethan truly notice her. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone. Simple jeans, white sneakers spotted with tiny flecks of dried paint, a light denim jacket over a cream-colored blouse. Natural curls framed a warm, expressive face. There was an ease about her that money couldn't buy. She moved without rushing, smiled without performing, worked without seeking attention. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan found that more captivating than any glamorous socialite he had met at charity galas. She carefully packed away the children's artwork before handing each canvas to its young creator with words of encouragement. "Keep practicing. I'm proud of you. Your imagination is your greatest strength." Every child walked away, standing a little taller. Ethan realized something. The most influential people weren't always those who led billion-dollar companies. Sometimes they were the ones who quietly reminded others of their own potential. He watched as the woman lifted her easel. One paintbrush slipped from her bag. It rolled across the pavement and came to rest beside Ethan's shoe. He bent down, picked it up, and gently brushed away a few blades of grass before walking toward her. "Excuse me." She turned. "I think this belongs to you." Their eyes met for the first time. Neither of them spoke for a brief moment. There was no dramatic music, no instant declaration of love. Just two strangers sharing an ordinary act of kindness. She accepted the brush with a grateful smile. "Thank you." "You're welcome. I seem to lose one every week." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe it's your way of making sure kind people introduce themselves." She laughed softly. "Or maybe I should buy brushes that don't roll." The conversation lasted only seconds, yet neither felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Finally, she extended her hand. "I'm Claire." "Ethan." She shook his hand firmly. "It's nice to meet you, Ethan." "You too." Neither asked what the other did for a living. Neither asked about status, money, or success. For the first time in years, Ethan appreciated being known simply by his first name. And though neither of them realized it yet, that small moment beside a fallen paintbrush would quietly become the beginning of a love story built not on wealth or ambition, but on mutual respect, honesty, and the courage to remain true to oneself. Claire slipped the paintbrush back into her canvas bag and smiled. "Well, thank you again." "It was nice meeting you," Ethan replied. "You too." She gave a small nod before turning toward the winding path that led deeper into Central Park. Ethan watched her walk away for only a moment before looking in the opposite direction. He had learned long ago that every meaningful connection didn't have to begin with chasing someone. Some encounters were meant to breathe. Some conversations deserved space. As he started walking, something unexpected happened. He wasn't thinking about stock prices. He wasn't wondering how many emails were waiting on his phone. He wasn't replaying the argument with his father. Instead, he found himself thinking about a woman who taught children that every painting was valuable because every perspective mattered. It was such a simple lesson, yet somehow it unsettled him. For years, Ethan had built businesses by convincing people to see the world through numbers. Claire encouraged children to see the world through wonder. Neither approach was wrong, but one nourished the soul. The other often exhausted it. He smiled to himself. Maybe success wasn't only measured by what you built. Maybe it was also measured by what you inspired. Across the park, Claire continued walking toward the small parking lot where her aging blue SUV was parked. As she reached the driver's door, her best friend, Maya Brooks, leaned against the vehicle with folded arms and an amused grin. "There you are." Claire laughed. "I wondered how long you'd been waiting." "Long enough to watch a very handsome stranger hand you a paintbrush." Claire rolled her eyes. "That's all it was." "Mm-hmm. It really was." Maya opened the passenger door. "I've known you since college. You don't usually smile like that after someone returns a paintbrush." Claire placed her art supplies in the back seat. "I smiled because he was polite." "So, polite is your type now?" "My type," Claire said as she climbed into the driver's seat, "is emotional maturity." Maya burst into laughter. "Good luck finding that." Claire started the engine before answering. "I'd rather stay single than settle." The statement wasn't defensive. It was peaceful. Years earlier, she might have laughed nervously and changed the subject. Not anymore. She had spent too much of her 20s believing that love required endless compromise. Now she understood something different. Healthy love required honesty, not self-erasure. As they drove toward Brooklyn, Maya glanced over. "You've been different these last few months." "In a good way or a bad way?" "In a healthier way." Claire smiled. "I finally stopped apologizing for having boundaries." "What changed?" Claire was quiet for several seconds. Finally she answered. "I got tired of explaining why respect should be normal." Her mind drifted back 2 years. Back to Daniel. Everyone thought they were the perfect couple. He was charming, successful, confident, the kind of man who could make an entire room laugh. But, behind closed doors, everything became a negotiation. If Claire wanted an evening alone to paint, Daniel called her selfish. If she spent time with friends, he accused her of choosing everyone over him. if she disagreed with him. He insisted she was being difficult. Little by little, she stopped expressing her opinions, not because she agreed with him, because arguing became exhausting. One evening, while preparing for an art exhibition, Daniel walked into her studio carrying 2 tickets. "We're leaving for Miami tomorrow." Claire looked up from her canvas. "Tomorrow? Surprise." "I can't." His smile disappeared. "What do you mean you can't?" "My exhibition opens this weekend." So I've spent 6 months preparing." Daniel shrugged. "There'll be another exhibition." Claire stared at him. "No." He frowned. "What?" "There won't." He laughed as though she were joking. "I'm serious." "So am I." She slowly placed her brush on the table. "For 6 months you've asked me to move deadlines, cancel classes, postpone projects, and put my dreams behind yours." He folded his arms. "That's what people do when they're in love." Claire shook her head. "No." She met his eyes calmly. "That's what people do when they're afraid of losing themselves." Silence filled the room. Daniel waited for her to apologize. She never did. Instead, she quietly opened the apartment door. "I hope one day you find someone who wants the same kind of relationship you do." His expression hardened. "You're ending this?" "I'm choosing myself." "You'll regret it." Claire smiled sadly. "I already regret how long it took." She closed the door behind him. She cried that night, not because she believed she had made the wrong decision, because choosing yourself, after years of abandoning yourself, always hurts. Growth often does. Back in the present, Maya interrupted the memory. "You okay?" Claire nodded. "I was just thinking." "About Daniel?" "For a second." "Still miss him?" Claire looked out the window. "I miss who I hoped he'd become." She paused. "But I don't miss who I became while I was with him." Maya smiled. "That's the healthiest thing you've ever said." Educational moments rarely arrive with applause. Sometimes they arrive as quiet realizations. You can deeply care about someone, and still recognize that staying with them would require sacrificing your peace. Love should never demand that you become smaller, just to make someone else feel bigger. The strongest relationships aren't built on control. They're built on mutual respect. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. The apartment occupied the top 2 floors of one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential towers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views. Original artwork worth millions decorated the walls. Every luxury imaginable was within reach. Yet when he stepped inside, the silence felt heavier than ever. He loosened his tie and looked around. Everything was beautiful. Nothing felt like home. His housekeeper approached. "Good evening, Mr. Sinclair." "Good evening, Maria." "I prepared dinner." "Thank you. You have several visitors scheduled for tonight." Ethan gently shook his head. "Please, cancel them." She looked surprised. "All of them?" "Yes." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow too." Maria hesitated. "In the 15 years I've worked here." She smiled kindly. "I don't think you've ever taken a day off." Ethan smiled back. "Maybe it's time I learned how." Later that evening, Ethan walked onto the balcony overlooking the glittering skyline. His phone remained switched off. The city stretched endlessly before him. Millions of people. Millions of stories. For the first time, he wondered how many of them were quietly carrying burdens no amount of money could solve. He thought about Harold, about the children in the park, about Claire. 3 completely different people. Yet each had reminded him of something he had forgotten. Life wasn't only about achieving. It was about noticing. It was about protecting what mattered before success convinced you it could be replaced. Standing beneath the evening sky, Ethan made a promise to himself. He didn't know what his future would look like anymore. He didn't know whether he would ever return to Sinclair Holdings. He didn't know whether he would see Claire again. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. From this day forward, he would never again trade his self-respect for someone else's expectations. It was a quiet promise. No audience. No applause. Just one man, choosing a different path. And sometimes, those are the decisions that change an entire life. As Ethan stood beneath the evening sky, he had no idea that the quiet promise he made to himself would soon lead him to the woman who would challenge everything he believed about love, success, and what it truly means to be rich. But before we continue Ethan's journey, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone or something, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started respecting yourself? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might encourage someone else who needs the courage to choose their own peace today. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring love story filled with powerful life lessons. And if you know someone who's working so hard that they've forgotten to live, or someone who's struggling to choose themselves over other people's expectations, share this story with them. It might arrive at exactly the right moment. Now, let's continue. Because Ethan believes he's simply walking away from a billion-dollar empire. What he doesn't know is that destiny has already begun leading him toward the greatest love story of his life. The following Monday morning, sunlight poured through the large windows of the Brooklyn Community Arts Center, painting warm golden patterns across the hardwood floor. Inside Studio 3, soft instrumental music floated through the room as children eagerly unpacked paintbrushes, sketchbooks, and jars of colorful acrylic paint. Claire Bennett stood in the center of the classroom with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, artists." The children answered in cheerful unison. "Good morning, Miss Claire." She laughed. "I hope everyone remembered what we talked about last week." A little boy in the front row raised his hand immediately. "We don't compare our paintings." Claire pointed toward him with an approving smile. "Exactly." She walked to a blank canvas resting on an easel. "Can anyone tell me why?" A little girl with braided pigtails answered quietly. "Because everybody sees things differently." "That's right." Claire picked up a paintbrush but didn't dip it into the paint just yet. "Imagine if every sunset looked exactly the same." The children looked at one another. "It would be boring," someone said. Claire nodded. "So why do we expect people to think, dream, or live exactly the same way?" The room became quiet. Even the parents, waiting near the doorway, leaned in to listen. "Your greatest strength," Claire continued, "isn't becoming someone else." She smiled warmly. "It's becoming the best version of yourself." The children nodded. It was a lesson about painting, but it was also a lesson about life. Claire believed education wasn't only found in textbooks. Sometimes the most important lessons were learned while holding a paintbrush, making mistakes, and discovering that perfection was never the goal. Confidence was. After class ended, parents thanked Claire one by one before leading their children home. One mother lingered behind. "Miss Bennett?" Claire turned. "Yes?" "My daughter used to be afraid to draw because she thought everything had to be perfect." She looked at the colorful painting in her daughter's hands. "Now she paints every day." Claire knelt beside the little girl. "I'm proud of you." The girl smiled shyly. "I even painted my grandma yesterday. I hope she loved it." "She cried." Claire laughed softly. "Those are the best kinds of paintings." As they walked away, the mother turned back. "You've taught her more than art. You've taught her confidence." Claire watched them leave, humbled. Moments like these reminded her why she had never regretted choosing purpose over prestige. Years earlier, she had been offered a high-paying position at an elite private academy in Manhattan. The salary was nearly triple what she earned now. The classrooms were state-of-the-art. The benefits were exceptional. But during the interview, the director had said something she could never forget. "Our students don't need encouragement. They need results." Claire had smiled politely, then declined the offer. She didn't want to teach children how to outperform everyone else. She wanted to teach them how to believe in themselves. Money could improve her lifestyle. Purpose gave meaning to her life. Later that afternoon, Claire stopped by her favorite neighborhood cafe. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't famous. The wooden tables were slightly uneven, and the menu hadn't changed much in years. But everyone knew everyone. As she entered, the owner looked up from the espresso machine. "Claire." "Hi, Mrs. Alvarez." "The usual?" Claire smiled. "You know me too well." "Chamomile tea and a turkey sandwich." "You remembered." "I remember everyone who says thank you." Claire laughed. Kindness had a way of making ordinary places feel like home. She settled into her usual corner by the window, opened her sketchbook, and began drawing the trees she had seen in Central Park. A few minutes later, the bell above the cafe door chimed. Without looking up, she continued sketching. Across the room, another customer quietly ordered black coffee. When the barista called his name, Claire's pencil stopped moving. "Ethan." She glanced toward the counter. It was him, the man from the park. He hadn't noticed her yet. He accepted his coffee with a grateful smile and looked around for an empty table. Only one remained. It was directly across from Claire. He hesitated, then walked over. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Claire looked up and smiled. "Not at all." He gestured toward the empty chair. "May I?" "Of course." He sat down, placing his coffee carefully beside a stack of books someone had left behind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural. Finally, Ethan looked at the sketchbook. "You're drawing the park?" Claire nodded. "I never paint a place until I understand it." "What do you mean?" She turned the sketchbook so he could see the unfinished drawing. "If I rush, I only capture what my eyes see." She tapped the page gently. But if I stay long enough, I begin to notice what my heart feels. Ethan studied the sketch. I've spent years looking at places. He smiled faintly. I'm not sure I've ever really noticed them. Claire closed the sketchbook. Most people don't. They're too busy trying to get to the next place. Her words lingered in Ethan's mind. He realized that described his entire adult life. Always rushing. Always achieving. Rarely appreciating where he already was. For the next hour, they talked about books, music, childhood memories, and favorite places in New York. Not once did Ethan mention his wealth. Not once did Claire ask what he did for a living. Their conversation felt refreshingly ordinary, and somehow, that made it extraordinary. As Ethan prepared to leave, he stood beside the table. I've enjoyed talking with you. Claire smiled. I have too. He hesitated for only a second. Would you mind if we happened to run into each other again? Claire laughed softly. In New York? It seems unlikely. Then let's leave it to chance. Ethan smiled. I like that answer. So do I. He nodded politely before walking toward the door. Claire watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd. There was no exchange of phone numbers, no promises, no grand romantic gesture. Just two people who respected each other's space enough to let life unfold naturally. Sometimes the strongest beginnings are the quietest ones, because relationships built on patience often grow deeper than those built on urgency. And neither Ethan nor Claire knew it yet. But fate had only just begun writing their story. As Ethan stepped out of the cafe, he paused on the sidewalk for a moment, the warm paper cup still in his hand. The city rushed around him as it always had. Yellow taxis weaved through traffic. Business professionals hurried toward their offices. Tourists stopped to admire buildings they had only seen in photographs. Nothing about New York had changed. Yet somehow, everything felt different. For years, every conversation he had was connected to a purpose. A negotiation, a partnership, an investment, a contract. Even dinners with friends often ended with discussions about business opportunities. His conversation with Claire had been different. There had been no hidden agenda, no attempt to impress, no competition over achievements. She hadn't asked what he owned. She hadn't tried to discover who he knew. Instead, she had asked questions that quietly revealed how he thought, rather than what he possessed. It had been refreshing. As he continued walking, his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. He had turned it back on earlier that morning, knowing he couldn't avoid reality forever. The screen displayed 27 missed calls. Another 15 text messages. Most were from the Sinclair Holdings board. Others came from financial reporters requesting statements. Then there was one message from his younger brother, Lucas. Can we talk? Please don't ignore me like you're ignoring Dad. Ethan sighed. Lucas had always found himself caught between loyalty and expectation. Unlike their father, Lucas wasn't driven by power. Unlike Ethan, he had never been expected to carry the weight of the family empire. He simply wanted peace. Ethan replied with a short message. Dinner tonight? Just us. The response arrived almost immediately. I'd like that. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face. Not every relationship needed repairing through dramatic speeches. Sometimes healing began with a simple invitation. Across Brooklyn, Claire was carefully locking the doors of the art studio when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Miss Claire. She turned. It was Sophie, one of her youngest students, running across the parking lot with her grandmother struggling to keep up. Claire knelt to meet the little girl at eye level. What's wrong? Sophie held up a folded piece of paper. I forgot to give this to you. Claire accepted it carefully. Inside was a crayon drawing. The picture showed Claire standing beside several smiling children beneath a giant rainbow. Across the top, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you for believing in me." Claire's eyes softened. This is beautiful. Sophie grinned. My teacher says I'm getting better. I think you've always been wonderful. The little girl's grandmother smiled warmly. She used to be afraid to raise her hand in class. Claire looked at Sophie. And now? The grandmother laughed. Now we can't stop her from answering every question. Claire smiled. Confidence changes more than grades. It changes lives. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. I wish someone had taught me that when I was young. As they walked away, Claire remained standing beside her car for several moments. She looked down at the drawing again. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were uneven. The colors spilled outside the lines. Yet, somehow, it was priceless, because it represented something money could never purchase. Belief. Claire carefully slipped the drawing into her portfolio. She kept every handwritten note and every drawing her students gave her, not because she needed reminders that she was making a difference, but because difficult days eventually came for everyone. And on those days, Gratitude became stronger than discouragement. That evening, Ethan arrived at a quiet Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street in Manhattan. Lucas was already waiting. Unlike Ethan, Lucas had never enjoyed expensive suits. Tonight, he wore jeans, a navy sweater, and running shoes. He stood as Ethan approached. For a moment, neither brother spoke. Then Lucas stepped forward and hugged him. It caught Ethan completely off guard. "You look like you needed that," Lucas said. Ethan laughed quietly. "I probably did." They took their seats. After ordering dinner, silence settled between them. Finally, Lucas broke it. "Dad's furious. I assumed he would be. He thinks you'll come back." Ethan took a slow sip of water before answering. "I won't." Lucas studied his older brother carefully. "You've never sounded so certain." "I've never been this certain." Lucas leaned back. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When did you stop being happy?" The question lingered between them. Ethan looked toward the restaurant window where evening lights reflected against the glass. "I don't think it happened all at once." He spoke quietly. "I think it happened every time I chose what everyone expected over what I believed." Lucas nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about leaving too." Ethan looked up in surprise. "The company?" Lucas nodded. "I don't want my life to become a series of meetings where everyone talks about profit but nobody talks about people." Ethan smiled faintly. "You sound a lot like Mom." Lucas chuckled. "She always said success should improve lives." Their meals arrived, but neither brother reached for the food immediately. Instead, Ethan said something he had never admitted aloud. "I don't know who I am outside the company." Lucas smiled. "I think that's exactly what you're about to discover. Sometimes, the people who know us best don't give us answers. They simply remind us that we're capable of finding them ourselves." Outside, rain began to fall softly against the restaurant windows. Neither brother noticed. For the first time in years, they weren't discussing quarterly earnings or expansion plans. They were simply brothers. And for Ethan, that felt like the beginning of becoming wealthy in a way no balance sheet could ever measure. The rain continued long after Ethan and Lucas left the restaurant. They stood beneath the awning for a moment, watching shimmering reflections dance across the wet Manhattan streets. Lucas slipped his hands into his pockets. "Do you remember when we were kids?" Ethan smiled faintly. "That depends. The summers Mom used to sneak us away to Grandpa's cabin." A warm memory surfaced. There were no board meetings there, no formal dinners, no reporters waiting outside the gates. Only fishing poles, old rocking chairs, and evenings spent watching fireflies. Grandpa William had never cared how much money the Sinclair family possessed. To him, success looked very different. One afternoon, when Ethan was only 13, he had proudly announced that one day he would become richer than anyone in America. Grandpa had smiled without looking up from repairing an old wooden fence. "And then what?" "I'll buy anything I want." "And then?" "I'll build the biggest company in the country." "And then?" Young Ethan had frowned. "I don't know." Grandpa finally looked at him. "Son, never spend your whole life climbing a ladder without first checking whether it's leaning against the right wall." At 13, Ethan hadn't understood. At 35, those words echoed with startling clarity. Lucas interrupted the memory. "You've been thinking about Grandpa too, haven't you?" Ethan nodded. "I wish I'd listened to him sooner. He'd tell you it's not too late." For the first time in years, Ethan believed that might actually be true. They embraced before going their separate ways. As Ethan climbed into a taxi, he looked out at the rain-covered city. For the first time in decades, he wasn't wondering what tomorrow would demand from him. He was wondering what tomorrow might teach him. Across the river in Brooklyn, Claire sat by the window of her apartment with a mug of hot tea warming her hands. Rain gently tapped against the glass while soft jazz played from an old record player in the corner. Her apartment was modest but filled with life. Bookshelves lined one wall. Paintings, some finished, some still waiting for inspiration, rested on easels throughout the living room. Photographs of former students covered a bulletin board near the kitchen. Every picture reminded her that success wasn't always measured by income. Sometimes it was measured by the confidence you helped someone discover within themselves. Her phone buzzed. It was Maya. "Tell me you're home." "I am." And what?" "The handsome guy from the cafe." Claire laughed. "We talked." "That's all?" "That's enough." Maya sighed dramatically. "Claire Bennett, you make romance sound like a library visit." Claire smiled into her tea. "I don't need fireworks." "What do you need?" She thought for a moment. "Someone whose presence feels peaceful." Silence followed. Finally, Maya said softly, "You've healed more than you realize." Claire looked toward the rain outside. Maybe she had. Not because she no longer believed in love, But, because she no longer believed love required abandoning herself, she had learned that the healthiest relationships don't begin with trying to impress each other. They begin with feeling safe enough to simply be yourself. She didn't know whether she'd ever see Ethan again. And surprisingly, she was perfectly okay with that. Because genuine connections aren't strengthened by urgency. They're strengthened by authenticity. Sometimes, the best relationships begin when two people stop searching for someone to complete them and simply meet as two whole people walking in the same direction. 3 mornings after their unexpected meeting in Central Park, Claire Bennett unlocked the doors to the neighborhood community arts center just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows. The room was quiet for only a few minutes. Soon, children began arriving with paint-stained backpacks, excited voices, and endless imagination. "Miss Claire!" 7-year-old Sophie called as she ran across the room carrying a folded sheet of paper. "I finished it." Claire knelt to Sophie's height and carefully unfolded the drawing. It showed a bright yellow house beneath a rainbow, surrounded by flowers that were much larger than the house itself. "It's beautiful," Claire said sincerely. "I made the flowers big, because happy things should take up more space." Claire smiled. "That's one of the wisest things I've heard all week." As the morning class continued, Claire encouraged every child differently. One struggled with confidence. Another became frustrated whenever a painting wasn't perfect. Instead of correcting every mistake, Claire reminded them that art wasn't about perfection. "It tells the truth about how you see the world," she said. "And nobody else sees it exactly the way you do." The lesson wasn't really about painting. It was about life. People grow when they stop comparing themselves with everyone else. By lunchtime, the classroom was filled with colorful landscapes, portraits, and abstract creations. Watching the children laugh reminded Claire why she had chosen this life. She could have pursued commercial galleries years ago. The money would have been better. The recognition would have come faster. Instead, she had chosen purpose over prestige. She had learned long ago that success without fulfillment eventually feels empty. After class, she stopped at her favorite neighborhood cafe. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee greeted her as she walked inside. She had barely reached the counter when she noticed a familiar face seated near the window. Ethan Sinclair. He looked up from his notebook, surprised. "I was beginning to think New York wasn't actually as big as people claim." Claire laughed. "Maybe we just have good taste in cafes." He stood. "Would you like to join me?" She hesitated only long enough to be sure she genuinely wanted to. "I'd like that." Their conversation began casually. Favorite books, travel, music, family traditions. Neither asked intrusive questions. Neither tried to impress the other. Instead, they listened. It was the kind of conversation where silence never felt awkward, because neither person felt pressured to fill every moment. When Claire mentioned she taught art classes for children, Ethan looked genuinely interested. "What made you choose that?" She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "When I was growing up, an art teacher believed in me before I believed in myself." She smiled at the memory. "I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd become that person for someone else." Ethan nodded slowly. "I don't think people realize how much one person's kindness can change another person's life." Claire looked at him. "It sounds like you've been thinking about that lately." "I have." He didn't explain further. Some truths take time before they're ready to be spoken aloud. When they finally stood to leave, neither suggested exchanging phone numbers. Neither forced the moment into something it wasn't. Sometimes the healthiest beginnings are the ones that aren't rushed. They simply wished each other a good afternoon and walked in opposite directions. Yet both carried the conversation with them long after they had left the cafe. That evening, Ethan attended another executive meeting at Sinclair Holdings. Charts filled enormous screens. Profits, forecasts, acquisitions. The discussion sounded exactly like every meeting he had attended for the past 15 years. Only this time, something had changed. As executives debated another expansion strategy, Ethan found himself remembering Claire's classroom. Children laughing, paint-covered hands, simple encouragement, purpose. He realized something uncomfortable. He could remember quarterly revenue from 5 years earlier more easily than he could remember the last time he genuinely enjoyed an ordinary day. When the meeting ended, Lucas caught up with him in the hallway. "You disappeared halfway through." "I was sitting right there." "Physically." Ethan smiled. "You noticed." "I've known you too long not to." They decided to have dinner together. As rain began falling outside the restaurant, Lucas asked quietly, "Do you remember Grandpa's favorite saying?" Ethan nodded before Lucas could finish. "Never spend your whole life climbing a ladder without first checking whether it's leaning against the right wall." For years, Ethan had dismissed those words as sentimental. Tonight they sounded like wisdom he had been avoiding. After saying goodnight to Lucas, Ethan rode home through rain-covered streets. For the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like another obligation. It felt like an opportunity. Across the city, Claire sat beside the window of her apartment with a cup of tea. Soft jazz drifted through the room, while rain tapped gently against the glass. Her apartment reflected her life. Paintings leaned against the walls. Books filled every shelf. Photographs of former students decorated a bulletin board near the kitchen. Each smiling face reminded her that meaningful work leaves traces in other people's lives. Her phone rang. It was Maya. "So, Maya said with obvious curiosity. "The businessman." Claire laughed. "We had coffee. And? We talked." "That's it?" Claire smiled. "That was enough." Maya sighed dramatically. "One day you're going to have to admit when you like someone." Claire looked toward the rain. "I do think he's interesting." "There it is." "But interest isn't the same as trust." Maya became quiet. Claire continued softly. "I've learned that real relationships aren't built by moving quickly. They're built by showing up consistently." She remembered Daniel. Promises that had sounded beautiful. Attention that had slowly turned into control. The experience had hurt deeply, but it had also taught her something priceless. Love should never require shrinking yourself to make someone else comfortable. Healthy love makes room for both people to grow. "I don't want someone to rescue me," Claire said. "I want someone who respects the life I've already built." After ending the call, she opened Sophie's drawing from earlier that day. Happy things should take up more space. Claire smiled. Perhaps that lesson wasn't only for children. Perhaps adults needed the reminder even more. The next afternoon, Ethan found himself wandering into one of New York City's oldest independent bookstores. He hadn't entered a bookstore simply to browse in years. Business manuals had long replaced novels. Financial reports had replaced curiosity. Today, however, he ignored the business section completely. Instead, he wandered toward books on creativity, architecture, photography, and art. As he reached for a hardcover titled The Courage to Create, another hand reached for the same book. "I'm sorry," Ethan said as he looked up. Claire smiled. "I think the book couldn't decide who needed it more." They both laughed. An elderly bookseller, amused by the coincidence, disappeared into the stockroom and returned with a second copy. Now everyone wins. Outside the store, neither seemed eager to rush back into the demands of the day. Claire pointed toward a row of food trucks nearby. "I'm getting lunch." She paused. "You're welcome to join me." There was no expectation in her voice, only kindness. "I'd like that," Ethan replied. They carried their sandwiches to a public square where a young violinist played for passing strangers. Children chased pigeons. Office workers chatted on benches. An elderly couple quietly shared a single cup of coffee. Ethan watched the ordinary moments unfolding around him. "I've eaten at restaurants where reservations take months to get," he admitted. Claire smiled. "And? I don't remember enjoying those meals as much as this. My grandmother used to say, 'Never confuse price with value.'" The words settled gently between them. Claire looked around the square. "Some of the happiest memories of my life cost almost nothing." Ethan followed her gaze. He suddenly understood what had been missing from his own life. Not luxury, presence, connection, meaning. Claire turned toward him. "When was the last time you did something simply because it made you happy?" He searched for an answer. None came. Finally, he smiled with quiet honesty. "I honestly don't know." Claire didn't rush to fill the silence. Sometimes, the most compassionate response isn't advice. It's giving someone enough space to hear the truth they have just spoken. As the violinist finished his final song, applause echoed across the square. Ethan joined in. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt as though he wasn't only applauding the musician. He was applauding the small, forgotten part of himself that was finally beginning to awaken. Neither Ethan nor Claire realized it yet. What had begun as a chance encounter in a park was slowly becoming something much more significant. Not because either of them was searching for romance, but because they were discovering something even more important first: mutual respect. And every lasting love story is built on that foundation long before anyone dares to call it love. The following Monday arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky so clear it seemed to promise new beginnings. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. Claire returned to the Community Arts Center, where eager children greeted her with bright smiles and endless questions. Ethan returned to Sinclair Holdings, where polished conference tables, quarterly reports, and ambitious executives awaited him. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet beneath that routine, both of them carried an unexpected awareness of the other. Claire caught herself wondering whether Ethan had found time to read The Courage to Create. She smiled at the thought before gently pushing it aside. She had learned long ago that allowing curiosity to become expectation often led to disappointment. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in another strategy meeting, listening as board members debated a billion-dollar acquisition. If we close before the end of the quarter, shareholder confidence will increase significantly. Our competitors won't see it coming. This positions us for another record year. Normally, Ethan would have been leading the discussion. Today, he found himself staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. He wasn't distracted because he no longer cared about the company. He was distracted because he had begun asking a question he had ignored for years. What is all of this for? When the meeting ended, Lucas caught up with him outside the boardroom. You've been somewhere else lately? Ethan smiled faintly. Have I become that obvious? You used to know every number before the presentation even started. And now? Now you actually look at people instead of spreadsheets. Ethan laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. Lucas hesitated before asking, does this have anything to do with the woman from the cafe? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, she reminds me of the person I wanted to become before I got too busy becoming successful. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe she's not changing you. What do you mean? Maybe she's helping you remember who you already were. Those words stayed with Ethan long after Lucas walked away. That evening, Claire volunteered at a neighborhood fundraiser showcasing artwork created by children from her classes. Parents wandered through the small gallery, proudly pointing out their children's paintings. Laughter filled the room. There were no expensive sculptures or famous artists, only colorful drawings created with honesty and imagination. Claire believed those qualities mattered far more than perfection. As she adjusted one of the display frames, a familiar voice spoke behind her. I didn't know this exhibition was today. She turned. Ethan. He smiled, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. He looked around the room. It's beautiful. Claire glanced at the paintings. The children did all the hard work. A little boy tugged gently on Claire's sleeve. Miss Claire, is this your friend? Claire smiled. Yes, I think he is. The boy looked at Ethan. Do you paint too? Ethan chuckled. I haven't painted anything since elementary school. The boy frowned dramatically. That's too long. Claire laughed. I agree. Before Ethan realized what was happening, the little boy grabbed his hand. Come on. Moments later, Ethan found himself seated at a tiny table surrounded by children armed with brushes, paint, and blank sheets of paper. He looked helplessly at Claire. She grinned. I think you've just been recruited. One of the girls handed Ethan a paintbrush. What are we painting? He asked. Anything that makes you happy. The question felt strangely familiar. When was the last time you did something simply because it made you happy? He dipped the brush into blue paint. At first, his movements were awkward. The children, however, didn't care whether he painted perfectly. They cared only that he was trying. Soon, laughter replaced hesitation. Blue accidentally became green. Yellow splattered onto his sleeve. One child proudly declared that Ethan's tree looked more like broccoli. Everyone burst into laughter, including Ethan. Claire watched quietly from across the room. She had seen hundreds of adults interact with children. Some treated them as distractions. Others spoke down to them. Ethan did neither. He listened. He encouraged. He laughed at his own mistakes without embarrassment. There was kindness in him that no magazine profile or business headline could ever reveal. Perhaps that was why she found herself smiling. Not because he was wealthy, but because he was genuine. As the event came to an end, the children rushed to hug Claire goodbye before leaving with their parents. The room gradually became quiet. Ethan looked down at his paint-covered hands. I think I just embarrassed myself in front of 20 children. Claire laughed. I don't think so. They told me my tree looked like broccoli. They weren't wrong. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped the paintbrush. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, peaceful. Finally, Ethan said softly, I haven't laughed like that in years. Claire looked at him with quiet understanding. Sometimes, joy returns when we stop trying so hard to control everything. He nodded. I think I'm beginning to understand that. As they stepped outside into the cool evening air, neither realized that someone across the street had been watching. A black luxury sedan remained parked beneath a streetlight. Inside sat Victor Harrington, one of Sinclair Holdings' senior board members. He lowered the newspaper that had been hiding his face. So, that's where you've been spending your time, he murmured. His expression hardened. He had spent years helping build Sinclair Holdings into one of the most powerful corporations in the country. He had no intention of allowing its future CEO to become distracted, especially not by someone who, in his opinion, came from a completely different world. As the sedan quietly pulled away into the night, The first shadow fell across Ethan and Claire's growing friendship. Neither of them saw it coming. The black sedan disappeared into the evening traffic, its taillights fading beneath the glow of Manhattan's streetlights. Neither Ethan nor Claire noticed. They walked side by side for a few blocks, enjoying the quiet that followed the lively fundraiser. The streets buzzed with the familiar rhythm of the city. Street musicians played on busy corners. Couples wandered past cafes. Friends laughed outside restaurants. For once, Ethan wasn't thinking about tomorrow's schedule. He was simply present. "I owe you an apology," he said. Claire looked at him curiously. "For what?" "For nearly convincing those children that broccoli grows on trees." She laughed. "I think they'll survive." "I hope so. You were a good sport." I was completely out of my depth. That's what made it genuine. Her answer lingered in his thoughts. For years, Ethan had carefully managed every meeting, every speech, every public appearance. Tonight, there had been no script, no expectations, just paint, laughter, and children who didn't care how successful he was. It felt strangely liberating. They reached a small park overlooking the river and paused near the railing. The water reflected thousands of lights from the city skyline. Claire folded her arms against the cool evening breeze. "My grandmother used to bring me here whenever life became overwhelming." Ethan looked across the water. "Did it help?" She said something I'll never forget. "What was it?" "The world teaches you to chase more. Peace teaches you to appreciate enough." Ethan smiled quietly. "She sounds like someone I would have liked. I think she would have liked you too." The words escaped before Claire had time to overthink them. For a brief moment, they simply looked at one another. There was no dramatic declaration, no rushed romance. Only the quiet comfort of two people beginning to trust each other. Eventually, Claire checked the time. "I should head home." "So should I." They walked to the subway entrance. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Claire." As the train doors closed behind her, Ethan stood on the platform for another minute. He realized something surprising. He wasn't disappointed that the evening had ended. He was grateful it had happened at all. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Sinclair Holdings earlier than usual. His assistant handed him the day's schedule. "Mr. Harrington requested a private meeting before the board session." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Victor Harrington was already waiting inside the executive conference room. Tall, impeccably dressed, and known for his sharp business instincts, Victor had spent nearly 3 decades helping build Sinclair Holdings into a global powerhouse. He greeted Ethan with a polite smile. "Good morning." "Morning." Victor poured 2 cups of coffee before speaking. "I've noticed some changes lately." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Such as?" "You've postponed acquisitions. You've shortened executive meetings. You've declined 3 networking events." He paused. "And last night, you attended a neighborhood art fundraiser." Ethan's expression remained calm. "I did." Victor studied him carefully. "I hope you understand what's at stake." "I do." "Do you?" Victor stepped toward the window overlooking the city. "People invest in certainty, Ethan. They expect discipline. They expect focus. They expect the future CEO of Sinclair Holdings to act accordingly." He turned. "I would hate to see unnecessary distractions interfere with that." Ethan understood exactly what Victor meant. Claire isn't a distraction. Victor raised an eyebrow. "You've known her for less than 2 weeks." "I wasn't referring to Claire." Victor frowned. "I was referring to the assumption that a meaningful life threatens a successful career." Silence settled over the room. Victor finally spoke. "I've watched talented people throw away extraordinary futures because they confused emotion with responsibility." Ethan answered evenly. "And I've watched successful people sacrifice everything meaningful because they confused work with life." Neither man raised his voice. Neither needed to. The disagreement ran much deeper than the conversation itself. Victor believed success demanded sacrifice. Ethan had begun to wonder whether it demanded the wrong sacrifices. When the meeting ended, Victor offered one final warning. "Be careful, Ethan. Every decision shapes the company." Ethan met his gaze. "And every decision shapes the person leading it." Across the city, Claire finished her afternoon class as parents arrived to collect their children. Sophie lingered behind. "Miss Claire?" "Yes?" "Do you think grown-ups forget how to have fun?" Claire smiled gently. "Sometimes." "Why?" "They get busy." Sophie frowned. "That's sad." Claire nodded. "It can be." As Sophie skipped toward her mother, Claire stood quietly in the empty classroom. Children possessed an incredible ability to reduce life's biggest questions to simple truths. She wondered whether adults complicated happiness more than necessary. Later that afternoon, Maya stopped by carrying 2 iced coffees. "You've been smiling more." Have the first? You have. Claire rolled her eyes playfully. Don't start. I'm just observing. They sat outside the center beneath a large oak tree. Maya eventually asked the question she had been holding back. Are you falling for him? Claire took her time before answering. I admire him. That's different. It is. Do you trust him? Claire looked across the street where children were racing their bicycles. I don't know him well enough yet. And that's okay. She nodded. I've spent too much of my life mistaking potential for character. Maya smiled proudly. Now that's growth. Claire returned the smile. This time, I'm willing to let someone show me who they are, instead of imagining who they could become. That evening, Ethan received an unexpected text from Lucas. Dinner tomorrow? I think you have a lot on your mind. Ethan smiled before replying. You're right, tomorrow works. He placed his phone on the table and looked out across the city from his apartment balcony. For years, he had believed life was about reaching the top. Now he was beginning to understand something far more important. Reaching the top means very little if there's no one beside you with whom you can share the view. Far below, New York continued its endless motion. Somewhere in that vast city, Claire was ending her day with the same quiet appreciation she had carried into his life. Neither of them knew that Victor Harrington had already begun quietly gathering information about Claire. He believed he was protecting Sinclair Holdings. In reality, he was about to set into motion a chain of events that would test Ethan and Claire's values, their courage, and the fragile friendship that had only just begun. The storm wasn't arriving all at once. It was gathering slowly, just beyond the horizon, and neither of them could yet see the clouds. The next week unfolded with an uneasy balance. Outwardly, Ethan's life appeared unchanged. He attended board meetings, reviewed contracts, met with investors, signed documents worth millions of dollars. No one outside his closest circle could tell that something within him had shifted. But change has a quiet way of revealing itself. Instead of staying late at the office every evening, Ethan began leaving while the sun was still up. He started declining invitations to exclusive networking events that had once filled his calendar. He even found himself taking morning walks through Central Park before work, leaving his phone in his pocket instead of constantly checking emails. Those small decisions did not go unnoticed. Victor Harrington watched them all. Inside the executive boardroom, several directors exchanged curious glances as Ethan concluded another meeting 20 minutes earlier than scheduled. When everyone had filed out, Victor remained seated. You're becoming difficult to predict. Ethan gathered his notes calmly. I didn't realize predictability was a leadership requirement. It isn't. Victor stood. But consistency is. I've been consistent. Victor's expression hardened. No. You've changed. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. Maybe I've started growing. Victor offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. Growth is admirable. So is discipline. But never confuse personal fulfillment with corporate responsibility. Ethan slipped his notebook into his briefcase. I simply refuse to believe they have to compete. Without another word, he walked out of the room. Victor remained behind, staring through the glass walls at the employees moving across the office floor. He had devoted 30 years of his life to Sinclair Holdings. He had sacrificed vacations, relationships, and nearly every personal dream he once possessed. In his mind, sacrifice was proof of commitment. Across the city, Claire was preparing for the annual Community Arts Festival. It was the largest event the center hosted each year. Dozens of children would display their artwork. Local musicians would perform. Neighborhood businesses had donated supplies and refreshments. For Claire, it wasn't simply an exhibition. It was a celebration of confidence. Many of the children had arrived months earlier convinced they weren't talented enough. Now they couldn't wait to show their families what they had created. As volunteers arranged tables and easels, Maya approached carrying a clipboard. Everything is almost ready. Claire smiled. I can't believe it's finally here. You've worked non-stop for 3 months. I know. Maya lowered her voice. Are you inviting Ethan? Claire paused. I hadn't planned on it. Why not? Because I don't want him to feel obligated. Maya laughed softly. Claire. What? Inviting someone isn't the same as pressuring them. Claire looked around the room. Perhaps Maya was right. She had spent so much time protecting her peace that sometimes she forgot healthy relationships also required vulnerability. That evening, after debating with herself for nearly an hour, Claire finally sent Ethan a simple message. We're holding the Community Arts Festival this Saturday. No pressure at all, but if you're free, we'd love to have you there. She set her phone aside without expecting an immediate reply. Less than 2 minutes later, it buzzed. I'd be honored to come. Claire smiled before locking her phone. The response felt genuine, not because he had accepted, but because he had chosen the word honored. Saturday morning arrived bright and cool. The community center transformed into a festival of color. Children proudly stood beside their paintings. Parents carried homemade desserts. Neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles. There were no expensive decorations, no celebrity guests, only people celebrating one another. Ethan arrived carrying several large boxes. Claire walked over, surprised. "You didn't have to bring anything." "I know." He opened one of the boxes. Inside were brand new paintbrushes, sketchbooks, watercolor sets, and art supplies. "I remembered some of the children sharing materials last time." Claire looked at him, genuinely touched. "You noticed that?" "I noticed they deserved better." She smiled. "Thank you." Before she could say anything else, Sophie ran toward them. "Mr. Ethan!" He knelt with a grin. "Hi, Sophie." She looked inside the boxes. "Are these for us?" "They are." Sophie threw her arms around him without hesitation. "You remembered." Ethan laughed in surprise before gently hugging her back. Claire watched the moment, quietly. He hadn't donated the supplies to impress anyone. There were no photographers, no media, no executives. Just grateful children. She realized that kindness is often most authentic when no one important is watching. Or so she thought. Across the street, a photographer lowered a camera after taking several pictures. He wasn't covering the festival. He had been hired by Victor Harrington. The assignment had been simple. Find out everything you can about Claire Bennett. Gather photographs. Learn who she is. Discover why Ethan Sinclair keeps returning to her world. The photographer slipped the camera into his bag and quietly disappeared before anyone noticed him. Inside the festival, laughter echoed through the building. Parents applauded as children explained the stories behind their paintings. One little girl pointed to a picture of a broken bridge painted beside a newly planted tree. "My parents got divorced," she explained softly. "But my teacher said broken things can grow beautiful things too." Several adults wiped tears from their eyes. Ethan looked toward Claire. She hadn't merely taught these children how to paint. She had taught them how to heal. For the first time, he understood that changing lives didn't always require billions of dollars. Sometimes it required patience. Sometimes it required compassion. Sometimes it simply required showing up. And perhaps that was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He just didn't realize that before the weekend was over, the peaceful world Claire had built would collide with the ruthless world he had spent his entire adult life trying to survive. The Community Arts Festival continued well into the afternoon. Children eagerly led their parents from one painting to another, explaining every brushstroke with the confidence Claire had worked so hard to nurture. Laughter drifted through the halls. Local musicians played acoustic melodies near the entrance. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before were now sharing stories over homemade desserts and cups of coffee. Ethan wandered slowly through the exhibition, taking his time with every display. One painting in particular caught his attention. It showed a mountain with two winding paths leading to the summit. The first path was wide, smooth, and crowded with travelers. The second was narrow, steep, and almost empty. A handwritten note beneath the painting read, "The easy road helps you arrive. The right road helps you become." Ethan stood there longer than he realized. "One of my students painted that," Claire said as she joined him. "It's remarkable." He struggled with confidence for months. She smiled proudly. That painting was the first time he believed his own ideas were worth sharing. Ethan looked around the room. "You've built something extraordinary here." Claire shook her head. "I didn't build it alone. You inspired it." She looked thoughtfully at the children laughing nearby. "I simply gave them a place where they didn't have to earn acceptance." Her words settled deeply inside him. He wondered what his own life might have looked like if someone had taught him that success and acceptance were not the same thing. As the festival drew to a close, volunteers began packing away tables and artwork. Without being asked, Ethan rolled up his sleeves and started helping. He carried boxes, folded chairs, swept the floor, stacked easels. Several volunteers whispered among themselves. None of them recognized him as one of the country's most influential business leaders. To them, he was simply a man helping after the event. Claire watched him quietly. Status had a way of disappearing when character stepped forward. That evening, after the last volunteer had gone home, Claire and Ethan sat on the front steps of the community center, sharing slices of leftover apple pie. The city seemed unusually peaceful. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Of course." "What did you dream about before business became your whole life?" Ethan laughed softly. "I haven't thought about that in years." He looked down at his hands. "When I was 16, I wanted to design buildings." "Architecture?" He nodded. I used to sketch constantly. What happened? My father believed architects worked for visionaries. And? He expected me to become the visionary. Claire remained silent. She knew some stories deserved space before advice. So, Ethan continued, I studied finance instead. Do you regret it? He didn't answer immediately. I don't regret building something meaningful. He paused. I regret believing I had to abandon everything else to do it. Claire smiled gently. Sometimes we mistake sacrifice for maturity. He looked at her. What do you mean? My grandmother used to tell me that growing older should expand your life, not shrink it. Ethan smiled. I think I would have enjoyed meeting your grandmother. I think she would have challenged you. I probably needed that. They laughed together. It was effortless, natural, the kind of conversation neither of them felt the need to force. Across town, Victor Harrington sat alone in his office, long after everyone else had gone home. A thick envelope rested on his desk. The private investigator had delivered it less than an hour earlier. Victor opened it slowly. Inside were photographs from the festival. Ethan laughing with children. Ethan carrying art supplies. Ethan helping clean up. Ethan sitting beside Claire on the front steps. Victor frowned. There was nothing inappropriate in any of the photographs. Nothing scandalous. Nothing embarrassing. Yet that somehow concerned him even more. He leaned back in his chair. This isn't infatuation, he murmured. He's changing. Victor believed that change could cost the company everything. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Richard, he said, when the call was answered. We need to move the succession meeting forward. The voice on the other end sounded surprised. You're certain? Completely. I think Ethan needs a reminder of what's expected from him. Victor ended the call and looked once more at the photograph of Ethan smiling beside Claire. He convinced himself he was protecting Sinclair Holdings. Deep down, however, another emotion had begun quietly taking root. Fear. Because if Ethan chose a different path, others inside the company might begin questioning the sacrifices they had made as well. Sunday morning, Ethan visited his late grandfather's grave for the first time in almost 2 years. The cemetery overlooked rolling hills just outside the city. He placed a small bouquet of white lilies beside the headstone. I've been away too long, he said quietly. The breeze rustled through the trees. He smiled faintly. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you tried to teach me. He remembered countless afternoons spent at the old family cabin. Grandpa William had never measured a person's worth by titles or wealth. He measured it by integrity, kindness, and the people whose lives became better because you had lived. Standing there, Ethan made himself a promise. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would never again build success at the expense of the person he wanted to be. As he walked back toward his car, his phone buzzed. It was a calendar notification. Emergency executive meeting, Monday, 8 a.m. He frowned. No explanation, no agenda, just a mandatory meeting called by the board. A strange feeling settled over him. Across the city, Claire unlocked the doors to the arts center, unaware that the quiet friendship she and Ethan had been nurturing was about to be tested by forces neither of them had invited into their lives. By Monday morning, the battle would no longer be internal. It would begin in the boardroom. Monday morning arrived with an unusual stillness. By 8 o'clock, every seat around the executive boardroom table at Sinclair Holdings was occupied. The atmosphere felt different. Conversations were shorter. Smiles were polite but restrained. Even the assistants outside the conference room sensed that something significant was about to happen. Ethan entered precisely on time. As he took his seat, he noticed that Victor Harrington sat unusually close to the head of the table. Beside him was Richard Sinclair, Ethan's uncle and one of the company's largest shareholders. Richard rarely attended routine board meetings. His presence alone told Ethan this meeting was anything but routine. The chairman cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. We have several strategic matters to discuss, beginning with leadership planning. A presentation appeared on the large screen. Future leadership strategy. Ethan listened quietly as charts, projections, and succession timelines filled the room. After nearly 20 minutes, Victor stood. Our company has always succeeded because its leaders place the organization above personal interests. Several board members nodded. Victor continued. We cannot allow distractions, regardless of how well-intentioned, to influence decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of shareholders. Though no names were mentioned, Ethan knew exactly where the conversation was headed. Victor turned toward him. Ethan, you've recently reduced your availability for investors. You've postponed expansion initiatives. You've become less engaged in several executive committees. He paused before asking calmly, would you care to explain these changes? Every eye in the room shifted toward Ethan. He folded his hands on the table. I've reassessed how I spend my time. Victor tilted his head. To what end? To become a better leader. A few directors exchanged puzzled looks. Victor replied evenly. Many would argue leadership requires greater commitment, not less. I haven't become less committed. Ethan's voice remained calm. I've become more intentional. Richard Sinclair finally spoke. Intentional in what way? Ethan looked around the room before answering. For years I've believed the company deserved every hour I had. I still believe Sinclair Holdings deserves excellence. But excellence isn't measured by exhaustion. The room fell silent. He continued. A leader who never rests eventually makes poorer decisions. A leader who never listens loses perspective. And a leader who sacrifices every meaningful relationship eventually forgets who he's leading for. Several younger executives lowered their eyes, as though hearing thoughts they had never dared express aloud. Victor noticed. He quickly regained control of the discussion. This company wasn't built on comfort. No, Ethan replied. It was built by extraordinary people. And extraordinary people deserve leaders who understand they're human. Victor's expression hardened. This sounds dangerously idealistic. Ethan smiled politely. I used to think so too. The meeting adjourned for a short recess. As executives stepped into the hallway, quiet conversations immediately began. Some defended Victor's position. Others admitted Ethan had raised questions they had privately struggled with for years. One junior executive quietly said to another, I missed my daughter's birthday last month because of work. The other answered softly, so did I. Neither man noticed Ethan walking past. Their conversation stayed with him. He realized this wasn't only about his own life anymore. Many people inside the company had accepted unhealthy sacrifices simply because they believed success required them. Meanwhile, Claire was helping her students prepare a mural for the community center's entrance. The design featured people of different ages planting a single tree together. What does the tree represent? One little boy asked. Claire smiled. What do you think? He studied the sketch. Hope? That's one answer. A girl raised her hand. Family? Another beautiful answer. Sophie looked at the unfinished mural before saying, I think it's kindness. Claire's eyes softened. Why kindness? Because, if nobody plants it. She pointed toward the empty branches. Nothing grows. Claire gently squeezed Sophie's shoulder. Exactly. She realized that children often explained life's greatest truths with remarkable simplicity. The mural wasn't really about a tree. It was about the choices people made every day. Every act of patience, every word of encouragement, every sacrifice made out of love instead of pride. Those were the seeds that shaped lives. Back at Sinclair Holdings, Victor stood alone in his office reviewing the photographs from the arts festival. There was one image he couldn't stop looking at. Ethan kneeling beside Sophie as she proudly held up a painting. The smile on Ethan's face was unlike any Victor had seen in years. It wasn't the smile given to investors, or the media, or shareholders. It was genuine. Victor quietly placed the photograph back into the envelope. For a brief moment, doubt crossed his mind. Had he mistaken happiness for weakness? The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. He shook his head. No. The company must come first. Yet even as he spoke the words aloud, they no longer sounded as convincing as they once had. Outside his office window, employees crossed the plaza below. Each carried responsibilities, dreams, families, and hopes that extended far beyond the walls of Sinclair Holdings. For the first time in decades, Victor found himself wondering whether success truly required people to leave so much of themselves behind. He quickly dismissed the thought. Questions, he believed, made leaders hesitate, and hesitation in business could be costly. What Victor failed to realize was that refusing to question long-held beliefs could be even more expensive. By the end of the week, Ethan would face a decision that could reshape both his future and the future of Sinclair Holdings. And Claire, without even realizing it, would become the unexpected catalyst for that choice. The rest of the week passed beneath a quiet but undeniable tension. Inside Sinclair Holdings, conversations became more cautious whenever Ethan entered a room. Some executives admired the changes they saw in him. Others worried those same changes signaled uncertainty. Rumors spread quickly through the upper floors of the headquarters. Some whispered that Ethan was preparing to step away from the succession plan. Others insisted he was simply going through a phase that would soon pass. Ethan ignored the speculation. He had learned that people often create stories to explain what they do not understand. What mattered now was not convincing everyone else. It was remaining honest with himself. On Thursday afternoon, Lucas stopped by Ethan's office carrying 2 cups of coffee. I figured you could use a break. Ethan smiled as he accepted one. You're becoming predictable. I'll take that as a compliment. Lucas sat across from him and waited a moment before speaking. The board meeting hit harder than you're admitting. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It wasn't the meeting. What was it? The realization that so many people believe a meaningful life and a successful career can't exist together. Lucas nodded slowly. My father believed that. So did mine. And now? Ethan looked out the window. I think they confused sacrifice with purpose. Silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Lucas asked, Are you afraid? Ethan answered honestly, Yes. Of losing the company? He shook his head. I'm afraid of becoming the kind of man who has everything people admire, and nothing he actually enjoys. Lucas smiled. I don't think you're that man anymore. That same afternoon, Claire dismissed her art class a little early. The children hurried home, carrying colorful paintings that were still drying. As she cleaned the studio, she noticed Sophie standing quietly near the doorway. Is everything okay? Claire asked. Sophie nodded. My mom has to work late. I'll wait with you. The little girl climbed onto a chair, swinging her legs gently. After a few minutes, she asked, Miss Claire? Yes? Can grown-ups become friends the same way kids do? Claire smiled. What makes you ask that? You and Mr. Ethan. Claire laughed softly. We're still getting to know each other. Sophie thought about that. When I make friends, I don't worry so much. Claire looked at her curiously. What do you do? I just see if they're kind. The simplicity of the answer made Claire smile. Children had a remarkable way of seeing what adults often overlooked. Character before appearance. Kindness before status. Trust before assumptions. Perhaps friendship really was that simple. Later that evening, Ethan arrived at the community center carrying a long cardboard box. Claire looked puzzled. What did you bring? He placed it carefully on a table. I remembered you mentioning the children wanted to paint outdoors. She slowly opened the box. Inside were several lightweight folding easels. Brand new. Claire looked up in surprise. You remembered? I did. They're perfect. I hoped they would be. She looked at him for a long moment. You know. What? Most people hear. You listen. The words caught Ethan off guard. No one had ever complimented him that way before. His entire career had been built on speaking, negotiating, and leading. Yet Claire appreciated something far quieter. His willingness to pay attention. It's something I'm still learning, he admitted. She smiled. We all are. Together, they carried the easels into the storage room. Neither noticed the elderly janitor watching them from the hallway with an amused smile. As Ethan walked back out, the man quietly said, You're lucky. Ethan looked confused. In what way? You've met someone who makes you want to become more yourself instead of someone else. The words lingered long after Ethan left. Friday morning brought another surprise. Ethan received an invitation from Richard Sinclair. Family dinner. Friday, 7 p.m. Attendance requested. He rarely ignored family invitations. Still, something about the wording felt unusually formal. That evening, the Sinclair family gathered at the estate where Ethan had grown up. The dining room looked exactly as it had throughout his childhood. Crystal chandeliers, portraits of previous generations, an impossibly long mahogany table. Everything polished, everything perfect. Conversation remained pleasant until dessert. Then Richard gently placed his fork on the plate. Ethan? Yes? We've received an attractive proposal. Ethan looked up. What kind of proposal? A merger. Victor Harrington, seated further down the table, folded his hands quietly. Richard continued. Westbridge International, one of the country's largest investment groups. They're interested in a strategic partnership. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I've read some of the preliminary reports. Richard smiled. There's another element. What is it? Their chairwoman, Eleanor Westbridge, believes closer family ties would strengthen the partnership. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan slowly looked around the table. What exactly are you saying? Richard answered calmly. They've suggested introducing you to their daughter, Victoria. No one spoke. Finally, Ethan asked, as a business discussion? Richard hesitated. As an opportunity. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. You want to arrange a relationship because it benefits the company? No, Richard corrected gently. We're suggesting you get to know one another. Victor finally spoke. Many successful families have built lasting partnerships this way. Ethan pushed back his chair. I'm not negotiating my personal life. Richard's expression remained composed. No one is asking you to. It certainly sounds that way. The room fell silent again. For the first time in years, Ethan realized just how differently he viewed the people sitting around the table. To them, Relationships could be strategic. To him, they had become something far more meaningful. Without another word, he excused himself and walked out onto the balcony overlooking the estate grounds. The cool night air steadied his thoughts. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Lucas stepped outside. "I figured you'd need company." Ethan gave a weary smile. "I appreciate that." Lucas leaned against the railing. "You know..." "What?" "You don't have to become the person everyone expects." Ethan looked toward the lights of the distant city. "No," he answered quietly. "I don't." At that very moment, across New York, Claire sat in her apartment sketching ideas for the children's next mural. She had no idea that Ethan's family had just tried to turn his future into a business arrangement. Nor did she know that the quiet friendship growing between them had already begun to threaten people whose lives depended on keeping the old rules alive. The battle ahead would no longer be about schedules, meetings, or public appearances. It would become a battle over one simple question. Can a person choose love, purpose, and integrity without sacrificing the life they have worked so hard to build? What would you have done if you were Ethan? Would you follow your family's expectations and secure your future? Or would you choose the life that truly reflects your values, even if it meant disappointing the people closest to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them, and I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. In Chapter 6, Ethan will face a decision that could change his life forever, while powerful forces within Sinclair Holdings begin making moves behind the scenes. Will he have the courage to stand by his convictions, or will the pressure become too great? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Saturday morning arrived with a quiet stillness that Ethan desperately needed. The family dinner had left him with more questions than answers. He had spent years believing he understood the values that shaped the Sinclair legacy. Now, he wasn't so sure. As sunlight streamed through the windows of his apartment, he stood before a bookshelf filled with awards, plaques, and framed magazine covers. For years he had viewed them as milestones. Today, they looked strangely empty. His eyes settled on an old leather sketchbook tucked away on the bottom shelf. Curious, he pulled it free. Dust rose from its cover. He smiled faintly. He hadn't opened it in almost 20 years. Inside were architectural sketches he had drawn as a teenager. Bridges, museums, neighborhood libraries, community centers. Every page reflected a young man who dreamed of creating places where people could gather, learn, and belong. He slowly turned another page. Folded inside was a handwritten note in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. Success is not measured by how many buildings bear your name. It is measured by how many lives are better because you were here. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, it felt as though his grandfather was standing beside him again. He whispered quietly, "I think I'm finally beginning to understand." Across the city, Claire arrived early at the Community Arts Center. The children were excited. Today was their first outdoor painting session using the easels Ethan had donated. As they carried supplies into the nearby park, Sophie skipped beside Claire. "Miss Claire?" "Yes?" "Do you think Mr. Ethan will come today?" Claire smiled. "I don't know. He said he liked painting now." "I remember." Sophie grinned. "I hope he comes." Claire didn't answer immediately. The truth was, she hoped so too. Not because she needed his company, but because she had seen how relaxed he became whenever he stepped away from the corporate world. It was as though the weight he carried became lighter. Nearly an hour later, Ethan appeared at the edge of the park carrying 2 paper bags. "I come bearing peace offerings." Claire laughed. "Coffee?" "And cinnamon rolls." The children cheered louder for the cinnamon rolls than the painting supplies. Within minutes, everyone settled beneath the shade of large oak trees. Claire announced the day's assignment. "I don't want you to paint what you see." The children looked puzzled. "I want you to paint what makes you feel safe." The park became wonderfully quiet as brushes touched paper. Some painted grandparents, others painted pets. One child painted a tiny bedroom filled with books. Another painted a family picnic beneath a bright blue sky. Ethan sat nearby, observing. After several minutes, Claire handed him a blank canvas. "No escaping today." He chuckled. "I should have seen this coming." "What makes you feel safe?" The question lingered. Instead of answering, he began to paint. Slowly, carefully. When he finished, Claire looked at the canvas. It showed an old wooden cabin beside a lake. Smoke drifted gently from a stone chimney. Tall pine trees surrounded the porch. No luxury cars, no skyscrapers, no boardrooms. Only peace. Claire recognized it immediately. "Your grandfather's cabin?" Ethan nodded. It was the one place when nobody expected anything from me. Claire looked at the painting again. Maybe that's why it still feels like home. Ethan smiled. I think you're right. As the children packed away their artwork, Maya arrived carrying lunch for the volunteers. She greeted Ethan warmly. I've heard a lot about you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Hopefully nothing too embarrassing. Claire laughed. I make no promises. Maya watched them tease one another with quiet amusement. The conversation flowed naturally. There was no awkwardness, no pretending, no effort to impress. When Ethan stepped away to help the children clean their brushes, Maya gently nudged Claire. So? Claire sighed. I know that look. You smile differently around him. Claire looked toward Ethan, who was patiently helping a little boy wash blue paint from his hands. I admire the person he's becoming. And the person he already is? Claire smiled softly. I'm still getting to know him. Maya nodded with approval. Good. Why good? Because lasting relationships grow from discovery, not assumptions. Claire smiled. That was exactly how she wanted this friendship to unfold. One honest conversation at a time. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a phone call. The screen displayed a name he hadn't expected. Victoria Westbridge. He hesitated before answering. Hello? Mr. Sinclair? Her voice was calm and confident. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. My father mentioned our families recently had dinner. Ethan understood immediately. I see. I'll be honest, Victoria continued. I wasn't thrilled about being introduced through a business discussion. A small smile crossed Ethan's face. Neither was I. She laughed. Well, at least we agree on something. There was a brief silence before she continued. I called because I wanted you to hear something directly from me. I'm listening. I have no interest in becoming part of a corporate arrangement. Ethan felt an unexpected sense of relief. My thoughts exactly. Good. Then perhaps we can save ourselves a great deal of awkwardness. I'd like that. Before ending the call, Victoria added, I hope you choose the life you actually want, Mr. Sinclair. So do I. When the call ended, Ethan stood quietly beneath the trees. For the first time since the family dinner, he realized he wasn't alone in resisting expectations that others had created for him. But he also knew the conversation had only delayed the inevitable. Sooner or later, he would have to tell his family, and the board, that some decisions could never be made in a conference room. As he looked across the park, Claire was laughing with her students while helping them carry freshly painted canvases back to the arts center. Watching her, Ethan understood something with complete certainty. The life he wanted was no longer just an idea. It was becoming a choice. And every meaningful choice eventually asks for courage. Ethan remained in the park long after Victoria Westbridge's call had ended. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and watched the children carry their paintings toward the community arts center. For the first time in years, his future no longer felt like a road someone else had already paved. It felt uncertain. Surprisingly, that uncertainty didn't frighten him. It felt honest. Claire walked over carrying 2 folding chairs. You look like you're thinking. I've been told I do that a lot lately. She smiled. Is that a bad thing? I used to think decisions had to be made as quickly as possible. And now? Now I think some decisions deserve patience. Claire nodded. My grandmother used to say that clarity rarely arrives when you're rushing. He laughed softly. I wish I could have met her. You probably would have spent hours talking. About life? About everything. They sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree, while the last of the children finished cleaning their brushes. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence was comfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists only when 2 people no longer feel the need to impress each other. Finally, Claire asked, What did you paint today besides the cabin? Ethan looked surprised. What do you mean? The cabin was a memory. She tilted her head. But what are you hoping to build now? The question lingered. I don't know yet. He smiled thoughtfully. But for the first time, I'm asking myself that, instead of asking everyone else. Claire looked at him with quiet admiration. That's where real change begins. On Monday morning, Ethan requested a meeting with Richard Sinclair. His uncle welcomed him into the office, overlooking the city skyline. I was expecting you. Ethan remained standing. I wanted to talk about Friday. Richard folded his hands. So did I. Ethan spoke calmly. I've thought carefully about the proposal involving Victoria. Richard nodded. Go on. I respect her. And? I also respect her enough not to treat either of our lives like a business strategy. Richard sighed. No one intended to force you. I know, but intention and impact aren't always the same. The older man remained silent. Ethan continued. I spoke with Victoria. Richard looked genuinely surprised. You did? We both agreed we should decide our own futures. For the first time, Richard looked uncertain. He had expected resistance. He had not expected maturity. You've changed, Richard admitted. I hope so. Richard walked toward the window. When your father was your age, he never questioned these traditions. Ethan joined him. Maybe that's why it's time someone did. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Richard said quietly, Your father believed protecting this family required sacrifice. Ethan answered just as softly, I believe protecting a family also means protecting the people inside it. The conversation ended without complete agreement. Yet it ended with something equally important. Respect. Sometimes progress begins not when people change each other's minds, but when they begin listening. Across town, Claire received an invitation that caught her completely off guard. The envelope bore the seal of the New York Arts Foundation. Inside was a formal letter. She had been selected as one of 5 finalists for the city's Community Arts Excellence Award. The honor recognized artists and educators whose work had transformed underserved neighborhoods. Claire read the letter twice. She had never applied. Maya rushed into the room moments later. It came. Claire held up the letter in disbelief. I don't understand. You deserve this. It's not about deserving. It absolutely is. Claire looked around the classroom where children's paintings covered every wall. She had never taught for recognition. She had taught because she believed every child deserved someone who believed in them. Perhaps, she realized, recognition was simply a reminder that quiet work still mattered. That evening, she sent Ethan a brief message. I received some unexpected news today. His reply came a few minutes later. Good unexpected or bad unexpected? She smiled. Good. I was nominated for a Community Arts Award. A moment later, her phone rang. She answered. I thought this deserved more than a text, Ethan said warmly. Congratulations. Thank you. I mean that. I know. There was genuine happiness in his voice. No jealousy, no comparison, no attempt to make the moment about himself, only encouragement. I haven't won anything yet, Claire said. You've already won. She laughed. How? You've already changed lives. The award is just catching up. Claire felt unexpectedly emotional. It wasn't the compliment itself. It was that Ethan had noticed what mattered most to her. The following afternoon, Victor Harrington entered Richard Sinclair's office carrying a folder. The investigators finished their report. Richard accepted it but didn't open it immediately. What did they find? Victor frowned. Nothing concerning. No scandals? No. Financial problems? None. Richard looked up. So why do you sound disappointed? Victor hesitated. Because she is exactly the kind of person people admire. Richard slowly opened the folder. Volunteer work, teaching awards, community projects, letters from grateful parents. Everything pointed toward integrity. Richard closed the file. Then perhaps she isn't the problem. Victor remained unconvinced. The issue isn't who she is. What is it then? Victor looked out across the skyline. The issue is who Ethan becomes when he's with her. Richard didn't answer, because, deep down, he had begun asking himself the very same question. Only, unlike Victor, he was no longer certain that change was something to fear. Outside the towering headquarters of Sinclair Holdings, the city moved forward as it always had. People hurried to work. Children hurried home from school. Dreams quietly unfolded in ordinary places. None of them knew that 2 very different worlds were drawing closer together. One built on influence, the other built on compassion. Soon, those worlds would collide in a way that would force everyone involved to decide what success was truly worth. The announcement of the Community Arts Excellence Award spread quickly through New York's nonprofit community. Parents congratulated Claire after every class. Former students sent heartfelt messages. Local newspapers requested interviews. Claire politely declined most of them. She appreciated the recognition, but she refused to let attention become the reason she did the work. On Tuesday afternoon, Sophie handed Claire a folded note before rushing out to meet her mother. Claire smiled as she unfolded it. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself." Claire sat quietly for several moments. Awards were encouraging. Public recognition was flattering. But nothing compared to knowing a child had discovered confidence because someone had chosen patience over criticism. She carefully placed Sophie's note inside the same sketchbook where she kept the letters of former students. Some treasures could never be measured by money. Across the city, Ethan stepped into another executive meeting. This one felt different. Richard Sinclair sat at the head of the table. Victor Harrington occupied his usual seat. The atmosphere was unusually restrained. Richard opened the meeting. "I've reviewed the proposal from Westbridge International." Several executives straightened in their chairs. "After careful consideration, I've decided to postpone all discussions regarding a strategic partnership." A ripple of surprise moved around the room. Victor looked toward Richard. "May I ask why?" Richard answered calmly. "Because partnerships built under unnecessary pressure rarely produce wise decisions." Victor's jaw tightened. "But the financial advantages will still exist 6 months from now, if they're truly worthwhile." Richard's voice remained composed. "We're not making decisions out of fear." Ethan remained silent. He hadn't expected his uncle to say any of this. Victor glanced briefly toward him, before returning his attention to Richard. The meeting continued, but the balance of influence inside the room had shifted. For the first time in years, Victor realized his perspective was no longer accepted without question. Later that afternoon, Ethan received another unexpected call. "Mr. Sinclair, this is Victoria Westbridge." He smiled. "It's good to hear from you. I was calling to thank you." "For what?" "My father told me the partnership discussions have been postponed." "I didn't make that decision." "No, but I suspect your honesty helped." She laughed softly. "I've spent years trying to convince people that business agreements shouldn't decide personal relationships." "So have I." There was a comfortable pause. "You know," Victoria continued, "I hope one day we meet under completely ordinary circumstances." "I'd like that." "As friends?" He smiled. "As friends." After ending the call, Ethan realized something important. Respecting someone sometimes meant refusing to use them for your own convenience. It was another lesson Claire had quietly reinforced without ever intending to. That evening, Ethan stopped by the Community Arts Center. He found Claire sitting alone in front of the unfinished mural. The room was quiet. Paintbrushes rested in jars of water. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. "You look thoughtful," he said. Claire smiled. "I've been staring at this mural for 20 minutes. Something wrong?" "I think something's missing." Ethan walked closer. The mural showed people of every age planting a tree together. Its branches stretched across nearly the entire wall. "It's beautiful." "It is." She smiled. "But beauty isn't the same as being finished." He studied it carefully. "What does it need?" Claire handed him a small piece of chalk. "You tell me." He hesitated. "I'm hardly an artist." "You don't have to be. You just have to be honest." Ethan stared at the mural. Finally, he walked toward the center of the tree and drew several small birds resting among the branches. Claire watched quietly. "Why birds?" He stepped back. "Because people only stay where they feel safe." The room fell silent. Claire looked at the drawing again. Then she looked at Ethan. "I think you've understood the mural better than anyone else." He shrugged modestly. "I've been learning from a good teacher." Claire smiled. "I don't remember teaching that lesson." "You didn't. You lived it." Her eyes softened. For a moment, neither spoke. Their friendship had reached a place where compliments no longer felt like attempts to impress. They felt like simple observations, truth spoken without expectation. Across town, Victor Harrington stood inside the archives room at Sinclair Holdings. Old photographs lined the shelves. Annual reports stretched back decades. His eyes settled on a framed picture taken 30 years earlier. It showed himself standing beside Ethan's father during the opening of the company's first international headquarters. Both men looked exhausted. Both looked proud. Victor quietly removed the frame from the shelf. He remembered that day vividly. He had missed his son's piano recital. Ethan's father had missed his wedding anniversary. At the time, they had congratulated each other on their dedication. Now, for the first time in decades, Victor wondered what those sacrifices had truly cost. His phone vibrated. A message from his estranged son. "Dad, if you're free, Emma has her school concert Friday evening. She keeps asking whether Grandpa is coming." Victor stared at the screen. He couldn't remember the last time his son had invited him anywhere. Slowly he sat down. Perhaps Ethan's questions were beginning to reach more people than anyone realized. Perhaps leadership wasn't only about changing companies. Perhaps it was also about changing hearts. Victor looked at the invitation one last time before quietly whispering to himself, "Maybe it's not too late." But whether he would accept that invitation or continue clinging to the life he had always known remained uncertain. Sometimes the hardest boardroom a person ever enters is the one inside their own heart. Friday evening arrived beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and deep blue. Across New York, office buildings slowly emptied as people made their way home to their families. For the first time in many years, Victor Harrington did not return to Sinclair Holdings after his final meeting. Instead, He drove across town to an elementary school auditorium. He sat quietly in the last row, unsure whether anyone would recognize him. The lights dimmed. Children walked onto the stage wearing matching blue uniforms. Victor searched nervously until he spotted his granddaughter, Emma. She stood proudly in the front row, scanning the audience. Then she saw him. Her face lit up with unmistakable joy. She waved enthusiastically. Victor smiled and waved back, emotion tightening his throat. When the concert ended, Emma ran straight into his arms. "Grandpa, you came! I wouldn't have missed it." It wasn't entirely true. There had been many moments in the past he had missed. But tonight, he had chosen differently. His son approached more slowly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, his son extended a hand. "I'm glad you're here." Victor looked at the offered hand before pulling his son into a hug instead. "So am I." As they walked out of the school together, Victor realized something profound. The company had never kept him away from his family. His choices had. And if choices had created the distance. The following morning, Ethan met Claire outside the Community Arts Center. She carried a rolled-up sketch tucked beneath one arm. "You said you had a surprise." "I do." She led him several blocks away to an abandoned brick building tucked between two apartment complexes. Its walls were faded. Windows were boarded. The small courtyard was overgrown with weeds. "It doesn't look like much," Ethan admitted. "It doesn't." Claire smiled. "But look closer." She handed him the sketch. It showed the same building transformed into a vibrant neighborhood arts center. The courtyard had become a sculpture garden. The roof held a small community greenhouse. Classrooms lined the first floor. A public gallery occupied the second. Children painted murals along the outside walls, while musicians performed in the courtyard. Ethan studied every detail. "You designed all of this?" She nodded. "For years. So why hasn't it happened?" Claire laughed softly. "Dreams are usually more affordable on paper." He looked back at the building. "You never stopped believing." "I never stopped hoping." She smiled gently. "There's a difference." Hope, she had learned, wasn't pretending obstacles didn't exist. Hope was continuing despite them. They walked through the empty courtyard together. Claire pointed toward a cracked concrete wall. "I've always imagined planting flowers here." She pointed toward the roof. "A small garden there." Then toward the entrance. "And a library just inside." Ethan listened carefully, not because he was calculating costs, but because he could hear purpose in every word she spoke. When she finished, he asked quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. If someone offered to fund this entire project tomorrow." She looked at him expectantly. "Would you accept?" Claire thought for a long moment. "Only if I still had complete freedom to serve the community the way it needs." He smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." She looked at him curiously. "You've been around too many people who think money should buy control." He nodded. "Exactly." Claire folded the sketch carefully. "Support should empower people. It shouldn't own them." Those words stayed with Ethan. For years he had watched donations become negotiations, partnerships become leverage, generosity become publicity. Claire viewed service completely differently. She believed kindness lost something precious the moment it demanded recognition in return. That afternoon, Ethan invited Lucas to see the building. Lucas walked slowly through the abandoned space, examining the cracked walls and broken windows. "So," he smiled, "you've fallen in love with an old building?" Ethan laughed. "No. I've fallen in love with what it could become." Lucas looked at him knowingly. "I wasn't talking about the building." Ethan shook his head, smiling. "Claire has a vision. And I think the city needs it." Lucas stopped walking. "And what do you need?" Ethan looked around the empty courtyard. "I need to stop believing success only happens inside boardrooms." Lucas placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think you've already stopped." Monday morning brought another meeting of the Sinclair Holdings Board. This time, Ethan requested the floor before anyone else could begin. "I'd like to propose something." The directors looked toward him. "I believe Sinclair Holdings should establish a permanent community partnership initiative." Victor raised an eyebrow. "What kind of initiative?" "We've invested billions in infrastructure and technology." Ethan stood. "It's time we invested just as intentionally in people." He presented a detailed proposal. Scholarships, community education programs, neighborhood redevelopment grants, support for local non-profits, arts education, mentorship opportunities. The room remained silent as he finished. Finally, one director asked, "What's the financial return?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "The strongest companies don't simply operate in communities. They strengthen them." Another director leaned forward. And if profits decrease? Ethan met his gaze calmly. I believe trust is one of the most valuable assets a company can earn. Several younger executives quietly nodded. Richard Sinclair remained thoughtful. Victor said nothing. He remembered Emma's smile at the school concert. For the first time, Ethan's proposal no longer sounded idealistic. It sounded necessary. Richard finally broke the silence. I think this deserves serious consideration. Victor slowly looked around the room. Years ago, he would have argued immediately. Instead, he found himself asking a different question. What would implementation look like? Ethan smiled. It wasn't approval, but it was progress. Sometimes, change doesn't begin with agreement. Sometimes it begins with someone becoming willing to ask a better question. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan stood by the boardroom window overlooking the city. Somewhere beyond the skyline, Claire was teaching children to believe in themselves. Here, inside one of the nation's most powerful companies, those same lessons were beginning to take root. Neither of them realized that Claire's nomination for the Community Arts Excellence Award had attracted attention far beyond the local community. Among those watching was a prominent national foundation, looking for someone to lead an ambitious new initiative, an opportunity that could change Claire's life forever. It was an opportunity she had never imagined, and one that would soon test both her calling and the growing place Ethan had begun to hold in her heart. The following Wednesday began like any other at the Community Arts Center. Claire arrived before sunrise, unlocking the front doors while the streets were still quiet. She brewed a pot of coffee, arranged fresh paint on each table, and reviewed the lesson plans she had prepared the night before. Within an hour, the familiar sounds returned. Children laughing, brushes tapping against jars, parents exchanging greetings before rushing to work. It was the ordinary rhythm Claire loved most. She had never needed grand stages to feel fulfilled. To her, changing one child's life was reason enough to wake up every morning with purpose. Just before lunch, the center's receptionist hurried into the classroom, holding a large envelope. Claire? Yes? This was delivered by courier. Claire wiped the paint from her hands before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with the seal of the National Foundation for Creative Communities. She quietly read the first page, then the second. Her expression slowly shifted from curiosity to disbelief. What is it? Maya asked. Claire looked up. They want to meet with me. For the award? Claire shook her head. No. She handed Maya the letter. The foundation had followed Claire's work for more than 3 years. Her teaching methods, community outreach, and measurable impact had drawn national attention. They were preparing to launch a network of community art centers across the country. They wanted Claire to become the founding executive director. The position would allow her to influence thousands of children instead of hundreds. The salary was generous. The resources were extraordinary. The opportunity was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Maya looked up from the letter. This is incredible. Claire nodded slowly. It is. But... Maya smiled knowingly. There's always a but. Claire looked around the classroom. Children were proudly showing one another their paintings. Sophie was helping a younger student mix colors. The walls were covered with years of memories. This place is home. Maya gently folded the letter. And maybe home is preparing you for something even bigger. Claire wasn't sure. She had always believed growth was important. But she also knew that not every opportunity was the right one. Sometimes bigger wasn't better. Sometimes it simply meant bigger. Across town, Ethan walked through Sinclair Holdings with a renewed sense of purpose. The Community Partnership Initiative had become the topic of conversation throughout the company. Some employees welcomed it enthusiastically. Others remained skeptical. As he entered the executive elevator, he overheard 2 junior analysts talking. I heard the scholarship proposal might actually happen. My little sister could have used something like that. Neither of them realized Ethan was standing only a few feet away. He smiled quietly. Real change often began long before policies were officially approved. It began when people allowed themselves to imagine something better. That afternoon, Richard invited Ethan to lunch. Instead of choosing an exclusive restaurant, Richard suggested a quiet cafe overlooking the Hudson River. Ethan noticed immediately. This isn't your usual place. Richard smiled. I'm trying something different. They ordered simple meals and sat by the window. For several minutes, they talked about ordinary things. Books, travel, family memories. Eventually, Richard set down his coffee. I owe you an apology. Ethan looked surprised. For what? For assuming I understood what was best for your future. You were trying to protect me. I was, Richard sighed. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that protecting someone isn't the same as controlling their choices. Ethan remained silent. I've been thinking about your grandfather. Richard continued. He used to tell me that leadership without compassion eventually becomes management. A small smile crossed Ethan's face. That sounds like him. Richard nodded. He would have been proud of the man you're becoming. Those words meant more to Ethan than any promotion or business award he had ever received. For years, he had searched for approval inside boardrooms. Now, sitting across from his uncle, he realized the approval that mattered most came from living according to his values. Later that evening, Claire stood alone inside the abandoned building she had dreamed of transforming. The setting sun streamed through broken windows, painting warm patterns across the dusty floor. She unrolled her architectural sketches and spread them across an old wooden table. Classrooms, studios, a library, a rooftop garden, a performance space. The dream felt so close she could almost see children filling the empty halls. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned. Ethan smiled. I hoped I'd find you here. She laughed softly. I've been thinking. I can see that. He looked over the sketches once more. They're even more impressive than I remembered. Claire folded her arms. I received an offer today. His smile faded slightly. What kind of offer? She handed him the letter. He read every page carefully before looking back at her. This is extraordinary. It is. You don't sound excited. I am. She paused. I'm also conflicted. Ethan leaned against the old brick wall. Tell me why. Claire walked slowly through the empty building. If I accept, I could help communities all across the country. And if you don't? I stay here. She looked around. With the children who already trust me. Neither answer felt wrong. Neither felt completely right. Ethan considered her words before speaking. My grandfather used to say something whenever I faced a difficult decision. Claire smiled. I'm beginning to think your grandfather was a very wise man. He said, don't ask which choice is easier. Ask which choice allows you to become the person you're meant to be. Claire looked down at the letter in her hands. She had spent years helping children discover who they could become. Now, life was asking her the very same question. As they stood together in the quiet building, neither of them noticed the photographer across the street. He lifted his camera, took several photographs through a broken window, and quietly sent them to Victor Harrington. The message attached to the images contained only one sentence. They've begun discussing future plans together. Miles away, Victor looked at the photographs on his phone. His expression was impossible to read. The crossroads he had feared was no longer approaching. It had arrived. And whatever happened next would shape not only Ethan's future, but the future of Sinclair Holdings itself. Victor Harrington remained seated in his office long after sunset, the photograph still displayed on his phone. One image captured Ethan and Claire standing side by side inside the abandoned building, studying the architectural sketches spread across an old wooden table. To anyone else, it looked like two people discussing a community project. To Victor, it represented something much larger. Ethan was no longer merely questioning the company's traditions. He was beginning to imagine a future beyond them. Victor locked his phone and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. For decades, he had believed that control created stability. Now that control was beginning to slip away, and he wasn't sure whether to resist it or learn from it. The following morning, Claire sat alone in the Community Arts Center before her students arrived. The letter from the National Foundation for Creative Communities rested on the table beside her coffee. She had read it at least a dozen times. The opportunity was extraordinary. It offered funding, influence, and the chance to help communities across the country. Yet every time she imagined accepting it, she pictured Sophie's smile. She pictured the mural on the classroom wall. She pictured the parents who trusted her with their children every week. The door opened. Maya stepped inside carrying breakfast. You've been here since sunrise, haven't you? Claire smiled sheepishly. Maybe. You've been thinking too much. I know. Maya placed a warm muffin beside her. So stop thinking for a minute. Claire laughed. I wish it were that easy. Maya sat across from her. Let me ask you one question. I'm listening. When you imagine saying yes, what do you feel? Claire closed her eyes. Excitement. And? Responsibility. What about saying no? Claire hesitated. Peace. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Claire frowned. What does that mean? It means neither answer is wrong. She leaned forward. The real question isn't which choice makes everyone else happy. It's which choice allows you to remain true to the person you've worked so hard to become. Claire smiled softly. It sounded remarkably similar to the advice Ethan had shared from his grandfather. Perhaps wisdom had a way of appearing through different voices. Later that afternoon, Ethan invited Claire to visit the Sinclair Foundation, the charitable arm of the company. I want to show you something, he said. The foundation occupied a quieter building several blocks away from the company's headquarters. Unlike the towering corporate offices, its walls displayed photographs of students, teachers, and neighborhoods transformed through past grants. Claire wandered slowly through the exhibits. I had no idea Sinclair Holdings supported projects like these. We've always had the resources, Ethan replied. I just don't think we've always understood how much more we could do. He led her into a conference room overlooking the city. On the table were several concept sketches, community learning centers, youth mentorship programs, public libraries, scholarship initiatives. Claire studied them carefully. These are impressive. They're only ideas right now. She looked up. They don't have to stay ideas. Ethan smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. He took a deep breath. I've been thinking about your dream. The art center? He nodded. I believe Sinclair Holdings could help restore the building. Claire's smile faded slightly. Ethan, before you answer, let me finish. She nodded. I don't want the company to own it. I don't want naming rights. I don't want publicity. I don't even want the project announced unless you decide it should be. Claire looked genuinely surprised. Then what do you want? Ethan answered without hesitation. I want children to have a place where they can discover who they are. Silence filled the room. Claire could see he meant every word. Still, she asked the question that mattered most. If one day, the company changes its mind. It won't. But if it did, Ethan met her eyes. The building would belong to the community. Claire smiled. Now I understand. Understand what? The difference between giving and investing. He looked curious. When you invest only for yourself, you expect ownership. She gently placed a hand on the sketches. When you truly give, you're willing to let the gift become someone else's future. Ethan couldn't remember the last time a conversation had challenged him in such a meaningful way. Every discussion with Claire seemed to expand the way he viewed leadership, generosity, and success. That evening, Richard Sinclair sat alone in the family estate library. Old leather-bound journals filled the shelves. Searching for a particular document, he opened one of his late father's notebooks. A folded letter slipped onto the floor. It was addressed simply, "To whoever leads after me." Richard unfolded it carefully. His father's handwriting filled the page. If you're reading this, it means leadership has become your responsibility. Remember that companies are built to serve people. The moment people exist only to serve the company, you've forgotten why the company exists. Richard lowered the letter. His father had written those words nearly 25 years earlier. Somehow, over time, they had all forgotten them. He quietly folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The next morning, the National Foundation for Creative Communities called Claire. We hope you've had time to consider our offer. I have. We'd like to invite you to meet with our board next week. Claire looked around the classroom one more time. Children's paintings covered the walls. Fresh canvases waited on the tables. Outside, parents were already beginning to arrive. She smiled. I'd be honored to meet with you. The meeting wasn't an acceptance. It was simply the next step. Still, she knew it marked the beginning of a season that could change her life forever. Across the city, Ethan stood in the Sinclair boardroom holding the proposal for the Community Partnership Initiative. For the first time, he wasn't presenting a strategy designed only to increase profits. He was presenting a vision designed to increase hope. As directors slowly entered the room, none of them realized that the decisions made over the coming days would reach far beyond quarterly earnings. They would determine what kind of legacy Sinclair Holdings would leave for generations to come. And for Ethan and Claire, the paths they had been walking separately were drawing closer with every passing day. Soon, they would face a choice neither of them could make alone. The Sinclair Holdings boardroom was unusually quiet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished conference table. Each director had received a copy of Ethan's Community Partnership Initiative before the meeting. Some had highlighted entire pages. Others had written notes in the margins. Victor Harrington watched the room carefully. For years, he had been able to predict how these meetings would unfold. Today felt different. Richard Sinclair stood. Before we begin our regular agenda, I'd like to discuss Mr. Sinclair's proposal. He nodded toward Ethan. The floor is yours. Ethan rose, carrying only a single folder. There were no elaborate slides, no dramatic presentations, just a clear vision. When I first joined this company, he began, I believed leadership meant making the smartest financial decisions. He looked around the room. I still believe financial responsibility matters. But I've learned something equally important. A company's greatest strength isn't found on its balance sheet. It's found in the trust people place in it. Several directors listened intently. Ethan continued. When communities thrive, businesses thrive. When families are stronger, employees are stronger. When children have opportunities, entire neighborhoods change. He paused before opening the folder. I've spoken with educators, non-profit leaders, and employees throughout this city. They all shared the same message. People don't expect corporations to solve every problem. They simply want corporations to remember they're part of the community, not separate from it. He outlined the proposal: scholarships for first-generation college students, paid employee volunteer days, funding for community learning centers, grants for neighborhood arts programs, mentorship opportunities for young entrepreneurs, transparent reporting so every dollar could be tracked. When he finished, silence filled the room. Finally, Director Helen Brooks spoke. What's the projected cost during the first 5 years? Ethan answered confidently. The investment is significant. She nodded. And the measurable return? Before Ethan could respond, Richard spoke. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. The room turned toward him. We always ask what communities can do for our company. He folded his hands. Maybe it's time we ask what kind of company our communities deserve. Victor studied Richard carefully. Those weren't words he would have expected from him only a few weeks earlier. One by one, directors began asking thoughtful questions. Not hostile questions, constructive ones. How would programs be selected? How would success be measured? How would employees participate? The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. When the chairman finally called for a preliminary vote, Ethan held his breath. The proposal passed overwhelmingly. It wasn't final approval. Additional planning would be required, but it was the strongest endorsement Ethan had received since joining the company. As the meeting adjourned, Victor remained seated. Ethan, he turned. Yes? Victor stood slowly. I still have concerns. I know, but... He hesitated. I can't deny the room believes in your vision. Ethan smiled respectfully. Thank you. Victor nodded once before walking away. It wasn't agreement, but it was the closest thing to it they had shared in years. Across the city, Claire stepped into the headquarters of the National Foundation for Creative Communities. The lobby overlooked the Hudson River. Natural light filled every hallway. Photographs of community projects from across the country lined the walls. A receptionist welcomed her warmly. They're ready for you. Claire followed her into a spacious conference room where 7 board members waited. Instead of beginning with questions about budgets or credentials, the chairperson smiled. We've already read your accomplishments. We're more interested in hearing your heart. Claire relaxed. One board member asked, why do you teach? She answered without hesitation. Because every child deserves someone who sees possibility before the child sees it in themselves. Another asked, what does success look like to you? Claire thought for a moment. When former students return years later and tell me they finally believed in themselves. The room grew quiet. A third member leaned forward. If we gave you unlimited funding, what would you build first? Claire smiled. I wouldn't begin with buildings. The members exchanged curious glances. I'd begin by listening. Every community already has strengths. The best programs don't replace them. They help them grow. The chairperson smiled. That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. The interview continued for more than an hour. When it ended, Claire thanked everyone and quietly left the building. She had no idea whether she would receive the position. Oddly enough, she felt peaceful. She had answered honestly. That evening, Ethan received a message from Claire. Interview finished. He smiled and called her. How did it go? I honestly don't know. Were you yourself? Yes. Then you did everything you could. She laughed softly. You always make complicated things sound simple. My grandfather had plenty of practice teaching me. She walked slowly through Central Park while they talked. Leaves drifted gently across the paths. Families picnicked on the grass. Joggers passed by. Neither of them noticed how easy their conversations had become. They no longer searched for interesting things to say. They simply shared their days. Before ending the call, Ethan hesitated. Claire? Yes? I've realized something. What is it? You've changed the way I define success. Claire stopped walking. And you've changed the way I think about influence. There was a quiet pause. Neither rushed to say anything more. Some feelings become stronger when they aren't hurried. As they said goodnight, both smiled without fully understanding why. What had begun as friendship was becoming something deeper. Not through grand gestures, not through dramatic declarations, but through trust, earned one honest conversation at a time. Neither of them knew that by the end of the week, a single phone call would place an ocean between them, or reveal just how strong the bond they had built had become. The phone rang just after 8 o'clock on Friday morning. Claire glanced at the unfamiliar number before answering. Hello, this is Claire Bennett. Good morning, Miss Bennett. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. This is Eleanor Whitmore from the National Foundation for Creative Communities. Claire sat down. We've completed our final review. Her heart began to race. I'm pleased to tell you that the board voted unanimously. There was a brief pause. We would be honored for you to become our founding executive director. Claire closed her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't find the words. This is an incredible honor. We're delighted. Eleanor continued warmly. The role will require extensive travel during the first year. You'll oversee the launch of community arts initiatives in several states with future expansion to international partnerships. Claire's excitement was quickly joined by uncertainty. Travel, long-term assignments, new cities, new responsibilities. It was everything she had dreamed of, and everything she had never expected to face. We don't need your answer today, Eleanor said. Take a week. We want your decision to come with complete confidence. Thank you. After the call ended, Claire remained still. The classroom around her suddenly felt different. The paintings on the walls, the tiny chairs, the shelves filled with brushes and colored pencils. Everything reminded her of the life she had built. She whispered to herself, "How do you leave something you love to help even more people?" At Sinclair Holdings, Ethan was reviewing community grant applications when Lucas knocked on his office door. "You look busy." "I am." Lucas noticed Ethan's unusually cheerful expression. "Something good happened?" Ethan smiled. "I think today is an important day for Claire." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You haven't even spoken to her yet." "I know, but I have a feeling." Lucas leaned against the doorway. "You really care about her." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the skyline outside his office window. "I admire her." Lucas laughed. "I didn't ask if you admired her." Ethan smiled sheepishly. "I know." There was a long silence. Finally, he admitted, "When I'm around Claire, I don't feel like I have to prove anything." Lucas nodded. "That's rare. I've spent my entire life trying to earn approval. And with her, I feel accepted." Lucas smiled. "Then don't ignore what your heart is trying to tell you." That afternoon, Claire asked Ethan if they could meet at the abandoned arts center. He arrived to find her standing in the middle of the empty building, holding the foundation's offer letter. "You got the job." She looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "I just did." He smiled. "And, judging by your face, I'm right." Claire laughed softly. "I got it." Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward and hugged her. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Then, realizing what he had done, he quickly stepped back. "I'm sorry." Claire smiled warmly. "Don't be." It was exactly the kind of hug someone gives when they're genuinely happy for another person. They both laughed, easing the slight awkwardness. Ethan looked at the letter again. "This is wonderful." "It is. But, you haven't decided." She nodded. "The position starts in 3 months." He frowned slightly. "And? I'll be traveling constantly." His smile faded, though only for a moment. "That's a big commitment." "It is." Claire looked around the unfinished building. "I've spent years dreaming about creating this place. And now another dream has arrived." She sighed. "I don't know which one I'm supposed to choose." Ethan walked slowly through the empty hall. "When I was younger," he said, "I thought every important decision had one perfect answer. And now? Now I think life sometimes gives us 2 good paths." Claire looked at him. "So how do you choose?" He smiled. "You choose the one you'll still be proud of years from now." That evening, Richard invited Ethan to dinner at the family estate. As they finished dessert, Richard reached into his jacket and placed an old folded letter on the table. "I found this." Ethan carefully opened it. It was written by his grandfather. "The greatest leaders are remembered less for what they built, and more for the people they helped become builders themselves." Ethan read the line twice. Then a third time, Richard watched him quietly. "I think your grandfather understood something we forgot." Ethan folded the letter carefully. "I think we're remembering." Richard smiled. "So do I." Sunday afternoon, Claire visited the neighborhood where the abandoned arts center stood. Children played basketball in the nearby park. An elderly couple tended flowers outside their apartment. A young boy sat on the curb sketching buildings in a notebook. Claire walked over. "May I see?" He handed her the notebook shyly. The drawings were remarkably detailed. "These are beautiful." He shrugged. "I want to be an architect someday." Claire smiled. "Don't stop drawing." He looked toward the abandoned building. "I wish someone would fix that place." "So do I," Claire replied. "It could become something amazing." The boy grinned. "I'd go there every day." As Claire continued walking, His words echoed in her mind. Sometimes dreams weren't only yours. Sometimes other people had quietly begun dreaming them too. That evening, she stood on the rooftop of her apartment building, watching the city lights flicker to life. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from the foundation. "We look forward to hearing your decision next Friday." A second message arrived only moments later. It was from Ethan. "No matter what you decide, choose the future that lets you wake up every morning with peace. I'll be proud of you either way." Claire smiled as tears filled her eyes. She had expected advice. Instead, she had received freedom. And in that moment, she realized that real love doesn't pressure someone toward your future. It gives them the courage to pursue their own. Far below, the lights of New York stretched toward the horizon. Neither Claire nor Ethan knew it yet, but the choice waiting ahead would not separate them. It would reveal whether two people with extraordinary dreams could build a life where neither dream had to be sacrificed. A week passed more quickly than either Ethan or Claire expected. For Claire, every day brought another reminder of the decision waiting for her. The children noticed she seemed unusually thoughtful. One afternoon, Sophie approached her after class. "Miss Claire?" "Yes? Are you leaving us?" Claire looked surprised. "What makes you ask that?" Sophie shrugged. "My mom said people from a big foundation came to see you." Claire knelt so they were eye to eye. "They did? Does that mean you'll have a new job?" Claire smiled gently. "It means I have an important decision to make." Sophie was quiet for a moment before asking the question Claire had been asking herself all week. "If you leave, who will teach us to believe in ourselves?" Claire felt her heart tighten. She wrapped Sophie in a warm hug. "There will always be someone to believe in you." "But what if they don't know us like you do?" Claire didn't have an immediate answer. That evening, those words echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, Ethan stood before the executive committee as the Community Partnership Initiative received its final approval. The vote was unanimous. Applause filled the boardroom. Richard smiled proudly. "The Sinclair Foundation will begin implementation immediately." The directors congratulated Ethan one after another. Victor was the last to approach. He extended his hand. "Congratulations." Ethan shook it. "Thank you." Victor hesitated before continuing. "I spent most of my career believing strength meant never changing my mind." He gave a faint smile. "I was wrong." Ethan said nothing, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Victor looked toward the city skyline. "My granddaughter asked me last weekend if I'd be at her next recital." He smiled to himself. "I already told her yes." "I'm glad." "So am I." For the first time in years, the conversation between them carried no tension, only mutual respect. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the abandoned arts center. Workers were surveying the property. Architects examined the structure. Engineers measured the foundation. Claire arrived moments later. She looked around in surprise. "What is all this?" Ethan handed her a folder. The Sinclair Foundation officially approved the restoration project. Claire looked stunned. "You already started?" "I only authorized the inspections." He smiled. "Nothing else happens unless you say yes." She slowly opened the folder. Every page reflected the promise he had made weeks earlier. Community ownership, independent governance, no corporate branding, no naming rights, a long-term maintenance fund that could never be redirected for profit. Claire looked up. "You really meant it?" "I did. You trusted me with the future of this place. I trust your vision." For several moments, neither of them spoke. The old building suddenly felt different, not because it had changed, but because hope had become tangible. The following morning, Claire traveled to the National Foundation's headquarters for her final meeting. Eleanor Whitmore welcomed her warmly. "We are honored you've come." Claire smiled. "So am I." They spent nearly 2 hours discussing the position, the mission, the travel schedule, the expectations. Finally, Eleanor asked, "Have you reached a decision?" Claire took a slow breath. "I have." She looked around the room before answering. "I would be honored to work with your foundation." The board members smiled. But, Claire continued, "I can't accept the position as it's currently structured." The smiles faded into curiosity. "I've spent years building trust inside one community. If I leave completely, everything we've built could disappear." Eleanor folded her hands. "What are you proposing?" Claire slid a document across the table. "I'd like to lead your national initiative while remaining based in New York." She explained her vision. Regional leadership teams, local directors empowered to make decisions, virtual collaboration when possible, travel only when necessary. And the abandoned arts center would become the foundation's first demonstration campus, a model that other cities could learn from. When she finished, The room was silent. One board member whispered, "That's ambitious." Claire nodded. "So is changing lives." Eleanor smiled. "You didn't come here simply to accept our offer." Claire returned the smile. "No. I came to improve it." That evening, Eleanor called Claire. "We've reached a decision." Claire held her breath. "The board unanimously accepts your proposal." Tears filled her eyes. "Really? We realized something today." Eleanor laughed softly. "We were trying to hire a leader. Instead, we found a visionary." Claire thanked her, overwhelmed with gratitude. She stepped outside into the cool evening air and looked toward the New York skyline. The dream she had refused to abandon had just become even bigger than she imagined. At that exact moment, Ethan stood inside the restored entrance of the old arts center, reviewing renovation plans. His phone rang. Claire's name appeared on the screen. He answered immediately. "How did it go?" Claire couldn't stop smiling. "I don't have to choose." Ethan frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I accepted the role. And I get to stay." A broad smile spread across Ethan's face. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. Some victories are too meaningful for words. And although neither of them realized it yet, the decision Claire had made had quietly removed the final obstacle standing between two extraordinary lives. Lives that were no longer moving in separate directions, but toward a shared future built on purpose, trust, and love. 6 months later, the abandoned brick building that had once stood forgotten between two apartment complexes had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Morning sunlight poured through tall windows that had been carefully restored. The once cracked courtyard now overflowed with flowers planted by local families. Children hurried through the front doors carrying sketchbooks, musical instruments, and eager smiles. The sign above the entrance read simply, "The Bennett Community Arts Center." There was no corporate logo, no billionaire's name, no monument to wealth. Only a promise that the building belonged to the people it served. Claire stood near the entrance, greeting each child by name. Some had been with her for years. Others were attending their very first class. Every child received the same warm smile. Every child was made to feel that they mattered. Inside the main gallery, photographs covered one wall. They documented the transformation of the building, from broken windows and crumbling walls to bright classrooms filled with hope. One photograph showed volunteers painting together. Another captured parents planting trees in the courtyard. A third showed Ethan wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, laughing as children accidentally splattered paint across his sleeves. He had insisted that photograph remain. "It reminds me that leadership looks better with paint on it," he had joked. Across the city, Sinclair Holdings had changed in ways few people believed possible. The Community Partnership Initiative had become a permanent part of the company's identity. Scholarships had already helped hundreds of students begin college. Employee volunteer days became one of the company's most valued traditions. Neighborhood grants funded libraries, parks, mentoring programs, and arts education. Business magazines praised Sinclair Holdings for its renewed vision. But Richard cared most about something else. Employee turnover had fallen dramatically. Staff surveys revealed greater trust in leadership than at any point in the company's history. The company had become stronger, not because it had chosen profits over people, but because it had finally understood the two could grow together. Victor Harrington had changed as well. He rarely missed his granddaughter Emma's concerts. Weekend dinners with his son had become a cherished routine. One afternoon, while watching Emma paint inside the Bennett Community Arts Center, he quietly turned to Ethan. "I spent years believing success required sacrifice." He looked around the bustling classroom. "I never realized I was sacrificing the wrong things." Ethan smiled. "The good news is that you found your way back." Victor nodded. "And you helped show me the road." Claire's role with the National Foundation flourished. Instead of copying the same model in every city, she helped communities build programs around their own strengths. Her guiding principle remained unchanged. Listen before leading. Within a year, similar community arts centers had opened across the country, each reflecting the people it served. Whenever journalists asked how she managed such rapid growth, Claire always gave the same answer. "None of this belongs to one person. Hope grows best when it's shared." One crisp autumn evening, Ethan invited Claire to the rooftop garden of the Community Arts Center. The city skyline glowed beneath the setting sun. Soft lights illuminated the rooftop, where children had spent the afternoon harvesting vegetables from the garden they had planted months earlier. Claire smiled as she looked around. "I still can't believe this place is real." Ethan laughed. "I remember when it was only a sketch. And a dream." They stood quietly for a while, watching the city. Finally, Ethan spoke. "You know, I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts. I've presented to investors around the world. I've spoken in front of thousands of people. Claire looked at him with a playful smile. And? This feels much harder. She laughed. Now you've made me nervous. Ethan reached into his jacket. Instead of a small velvet ring box, he removed the folded sketch Claire had shown him the day they first walked through the abandoned building together. He carefully unfolded it. I kept this. Claire's eyes filled with tears. You remembered? I remember everything. He looked directly into her eyes. When we first met, I thought success meant building taller buildings. You taught me that the greatest things we build are often inside people. You reminded me that kindness isn't weakness. That influence is meant to serve. And that love should never ask someone to become less than who they were created to be. He took her hands. Claire Bennett. You've made me a better leader. A better man. And the happiest version of myself I've ever known. He smiled gently. I don't want to spend the rest of my life chasing success without you beside me. I want to spend it building hope, with you. He knelt on one knee. This time, he held a small ring. Will you marry me? Claire laughed through joyful tears. She looked at the rooftop garden, the restored building, the neighborhood they both loved, the man who had never asked her to give up her purpose. Instead, he had helped it grow. She whispered the easiest answer she had ever given. Yes. The rooftop erupted in applause. Ethan looked around in surprise. Children, parents, volunteers, Richard, Victor, Maya, Lucas and Eleanor stepped out from behind the rooftop greenhouse, all smiling. You planned this? Claire asked through laughter. Ethan grinned sheepishly. I may have had a little help. Sophie rushed forward first. I told everyone you'd say yes. Everyone laughed. Epilogue. 1 year later. The wedding took place in the courtyard of the Bennett Community Arts Center. Instead of expensive decorations, the walls displayed artwork created by the children. Instead of lavish gifts, guests donated books, art supplies, and musical instruments for future students. As Claire walked down the aisle, Ethan realized that the greatest day of his life looked nothing like he had imagined years earlier. It wasn't defined by luxury. It wasn't surrounded by business leaders or headlines. It was filled with family, friends, children whose futures had been changed, and a woman whose love had taught him that ambition and compassion were never enemies. After the ceremony, Sophie tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. Mr. Sinclair? Yes? Are you a billionaire? Ethan smiled. I suppose I am. She thought for a moment, before asking, Then why do you look happier here than on TV? Ethan glanced toward Claire, who was laughing with a group of children, while helping them paint a mural celebrating the opening anniversary of the center. He smiled. Because I finally learned that wealth can build buildings. But love, purpose, and compassion are what truly make them feel like home. As the sun set over New York City, laughter echoed through the courtyard. The mural continued to grow with every colorful brushstroke. Children dreamed bigger. Families grew closer. A company rediscovered its purpose. A community found its heart. And two people who had refused to choose between love and calling discovered that the strongest relationships are not built on sacrifice, but on helping one another become the very best versions of themselves. What a beautiful journey Ethan and Claire have shared, from ambition and uncertainty to purpose, love, and a legacy that will inspire generations. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes that true love should help you grow, not hold you back. Now we'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in Ethan and Claire's story? Was it the transformation of the Community Arts Center, Ethan's personal growth, Claire's unwavering purpose, or the unforgettable proposal? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every one of them, and your perspective could inspire someone else. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with love, hope, redemption, and meaningful life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next emotional journey. A brand new story is coming soon, one that will take you on another unforgettable ride through love, sacrifice, betrayal, forgiveness, and the incredible power of second chances. Until next time, remember, true success isn't measured by what you own, it's measured by the lives you touch, the love you give, and the legacy you leave behind.